Hey, everybody. Welcome, welcome, welcome. So glad to be here with all of you. Should be a lovely program tonight. So hit the like button, hit the subscribe button, hit the notifications bell. It's going to be a great show. I'm pretty excited. We're going to have a great conversation here. So many exciting things going on in the world, but it's always fun to just talk to all of you as well. All right. Every stream we do is exciting. Let's do it, folks.
Of the American century. I say that the century on which we are entering can be and must be the century of the common man.
A radical redistribution of economic power.
I mean, we know that racism is just a byproduct of capitalism. Everything would be all right if everything was put back in the hands of the people.
We need a government that will make sure Americans are taken care of and organize the economy to serve the people, not the profits of a wealthy few.
We now have the techniques and the resources to get rid of poverty.
We got to start getting out there with the people.
Get out of the movement and get to the masses.
We need a government of action. Welcome, everyone. So glad to be here with all of you. I got a few things that I want to talk to you all about. A few things to talk about. The way we do it, for those of you who may not be familiar, quick rundown. I give my opening remarks. It's what I've got on my mind, what I want to talk to you all about in the evening. And then after that, I do a roll call and we find out who it is on the other side of the camera, who's watching. And then after that, I answer super chat questions for the rest of the night. That's the conclusion of the show, is me answering all the super chat questions. So if there's something you want me to talk about in the second half of the show, by all means, shoot me a super chat. And there is no limit on super chats. This show could go for hours and hours and hours. We've been on here 3 hours sometimes because you guys ask so many damn good questions that get me talking. So if you want to make the second half of the show exciting, and if there's something you want me to talk about, by all means, shoot me a super chat question, because that's the best way. That's the best way to make the second half of the show amazing, and you all do it. And what we do here is very much, it's not just me talking into the camera, right? I'm watching the chat the whole time. I see Boxy Lady is finally watching it live, and other people are here. I see, Mark is humming, he's thinking, and, I'm always watching the chat. I'm always watching the chat. So by all means, folks, ask some good questions, react to what I'm saying. And, that's what makes our show awesome. Before we get going here, I am going to make a few quick business announcements. Quick business announcements. First business announcement is February 19th in Washington, D.C. There's going to be a very important anti-war demonstration. It's called Rage Against the War Machine. And the Center for Political Innovation, the organization that I founded, is now, we are listed on the website as official sponsors of Rage Against the War Machine. So we encourage everyone to attend this very important demonstration in Washington, D.C. The Libertarian Party is mobilizing their forces for it. The People's Party of Nick Brana, they're mobilizing their forces for it. Code Pink and many organizations are coming together to say we don't want World War III with Russia. And so we think, that it would be essential. It would really be essential for folks from this stream and from this community to be there. And after the march on February 19th, at a hotel very close to where the march rally ends, we will be having a reception. And the theme of the reception will be, how can we prevent World War III? It'll be a lovely reception. There'll be food there, speeches, music, different organizations are going to have people there. So there you go. Jane Fredericks, do you think any of Hunter Biden laptops have been revealed to implicate the Communist Party in anything nefarious as is claimed? All right. I'm writing it down. writing it down. Always happy to answer folks' questions. But we're going to have a great event February 19th in Washington, D.C. It'll be at a hotel very close to where the anti-war rally ends, where the march ends. Food, speeches. So if you're in town for the anti-war rally, you really ought to come to the very important CPI event that's happening that evening. And then in March 25th and 26th, the Center for Political Innovation is holding a conference in Washington, D.C. Now, the nature of that conference, it'll be a 2-day event. I cannot reveal too much about that event yet, but you'll understand it when we make our public announcement. So there you go. Can't tell you too much about that event, but our rally that we're having in Washington, D.C., are after the big anti-war rally, our reception that we're holding will be themed around how can we prevent World War III. It's going to be really, really awesome. I'm very excited. The Chinese Communist Party. Okay. I was wondering, by the way, if you meant the CPUSA, Jane. I was a little bit confused by your first super chat. I'm like, the CPUSA? Are they that in bed with Biden? But there you go. All right. You mean the Chinese Communist Party. So there you go. All right. So there you go. So that's happening. If you want to be involved in our activities, and we're on the brink of publishing a new book. It is almost, I'm like uploading it tomorrow. If you want to be involved in the activities that we're doing, the best way to do that is to just become a member of the Center for Political Innovation. We need members. We have a Zoom call for all the members every week. We have a national Zoom call. Plus, at this point, we have a number of committees, the Innovation Committee, the Music Committee, carrying out different operations. We have a lot of great folks that are joining our organization. So if you want to be part of it, all you got to do is become a dues-paying member today by signing up on the website. And the other business announcement that I always mention is if you don't want to join the Center for Political Innovation, if you're more interested in just kind of supporting the work of this YouTube channel, you can become a Patreon member. You can become a member on Patreon. And if you join on the Patreon, then you can be part of some rather intimate, small patrons-only streams. You get a copy of our books sent to you as like a complimentary gift. It's a pretty good spot to be in. So consider that as well. So those are kind of the business announcements I wanted to make. It looks like tomorrow I'm going to appear on Convo Couch there's going to be a panel on libertarianism. Oh, thank you, Boxy. Thank you, Boxy. Thanks for everything you do. And thanks for being here. There's going to be a panel about libertarianism and communism. So I'm curious how that's going to go. It'll be me and Fiorella versus two rather prominent libertarian individuals. I don't know if it's going to be so much of a boxing match as a civil exchange of ideas. But we'll see how it goes. I love the Convo Couch. They do great stuff. And at this point, I feel like I've got more in common with libertarians than I do with most of the left. The left have completely lost their mind. So that's going to be an interesting panel. So keep your eyes out for that. That's happening tomorrow. And those pretty much are all of my business announcements for tonight. I think that's really all of it. So like I said before, the way the show works is I give my opening remarks, then we do the roll call, and then I answer super chat questions. So I'll continue writing super chats down as we go along, and I will continue writing down the super chats. And I'm just going to jump into my opening remarks. Folks, for my opening remarks tonight, I wanted to talk about something that I consider to be very important, which is the heritage of our movement. Where did we come from? Who has done what we are doing now before? Who has tried to do what we've done, what we are doing now with the Center for Political Innovation? Who has tried to do this before? On my recent stream, Last night, I talked about the problem of overproduction. I talked about the tendency of the rate of profit to fall. I talked about the tendency of the rate of profit to fall. I talked about the struggle for socialism and for the banks, factories, and industries to be controlled by the people, and how the capitalists respond to the economic crisis by struggling among each other and moving toward fascism. I talked about all of that. And I laid out why we're in the crisis that we're in, and I laid out how we could potentially get out of it by building a united front against the imperialists. That's what I talked about. And from there, I started talking about different things in American history. And I've studied a lot of American history. And I've studied a lot of different socialist movements that have gone on in American history and how we can learn from them. And I consider this to be very important, but a little differently than most groups do. Because one problem that we have on the left is that the left, the organized political left, the socialists and the communists and the anarchists are very different from the right wing, from the fascists, from the conservatives, from the white supremacists, from the far right. On the far right wing, people just do it. They just do it. The Proud Boys. The Proud Boys, if you meet the Proud Boys, they don't explain to you, well, we're a split from the American Nazi Party, and then we had a merger with the John Birch Society, and then the Ku Klux Klan broke away in 1867, and basically, if Hitler was alive today, he would be a member of our group because we're a split from. They don't do that. No, it's just somebody starts doing far right-wing stuff, and some people on the far right wing like what they're doing, and they do it with them. And other people on the far right wing don't, and so they do it with somebody else. The right wing, it's much more practical and pragmatic. There are certain things that people believe that are far right wing. There are certain activities and actions and movements among people on the far right wing, and they do them, and that's just how it is. But it's not like that. In the United States, if you join a socialist group or a communist group or an anarchist group, they have to start drawing charts and explaining to you how they're a split from so-and-so, who's a split from so-and-so, and so-and-so beget so-and-so, and so-and-so beget so-and-so, and so-and-so beget so-and-so. It's a bit weird, right? It's a little bit weird. And it's a problem. Right. I remember one time there was a friend of mine, and he was a member of the Workers' World Party, and he was driving someplace and he saw a sign for a church, and it had the name of the church, and below it said a non-denominational church. And so he called me and he's like, Caleb, I just saw a sign, a non-denominational church. And I said, yeah. And he said, Caleb, do you think that Workers' World Party were non-denominational communists? And I laughed. And I laughed, first of all, because this guy, the fact that this was the first time he'd heard the phrase non-denominational in his life, that was growing up, non-denominational churches were everywhere. That was the mega churches. That was the evangelicals. They were everywhere. So the fact that he'd never heard of such a thing, that just showed we had different backgrounds. But then the other thing that was amusing was there was an element of truth in that. In the Workers' World Party that I had been in for many years, it was a split from the Socialist Workers' Party, but it didn't claim their heritage. For a while, they tried to claim they were the one true Trotskyites, but it was pretty clear by the 1970s they were just doing their own communist thing, honestly, if we're going to get serious about Marxism in America, we need a lot more non-denominationalism. We need a lot more people just trying to do the communist thing. We need a lot less of this. Well, I'm the one true follower of the split from the split from the split of the, we need to get beyond that. So to some degree or other, I'm willing to break with the heritage. I'm not interested in forming the one true party that is the true interpretation of what Karl Marx said. I'm not interested in forming, one of the correct fourth internationals. All of it's really, really silly. However, at the same time that I'm not interested in trying to have the pure line and trace my lineage, my political lineage, back to Marx and explain how absolutely everyone is wrong. And I alone, my political line, carries with it the flame, the one true flame. We are keeping alive Marx's vision as all the other phonies. I mean, we don't want to be wild and sectarian, and we don't want to be wacky like that. But we should study the history. And I have always said, and one thing I've repeated on many of these streams, is that we should study all of it, all of the history of Marxism, all the history of socialism, all this history of communism, all the history of anarchism, all the history of working class, progressive movements, and peace movements. We should study all of it and blindly follow none of it. And as we study all of it, we should be looking for insights that could be useful in our time. That's the correct way of doing things. We shouldn't be looking at things with the perspective of how can we stay true to the line? How can we be the modern incarnation of something? But rather, what can we draw from the history and from the tactics that were used in the past and the movements that have been built in the past? What can we draw from them in our own time for the purpose of building a progressive working class movement against war and against imperialism and against the impoverishment of the working class, and moving toward a society where the banks and the factories and the major industries are controlled by the people? How can we draw from the movements of the past in order to build something that will be successful in our time? That is the way we should approach the history of our movement. That's the way we should approach it. If we were making cars, we would not only need to know about all the cars that currently exist, but we'd need to know the history of the automobile. We'd need to know the history. We'd need to know about Henry Ford. We'd need to know about Chrysler and Chevrolet. And, we'd need to know about the difference between an electric car and a diesel engine. That's how these things would work, right? If you're doing something, you should be aware of other people that are doing the same thing in your time. But you should also be aware of people who've done what you've done in the past, or tried to do what you did in the past, and be looking over their successes and their failures, right? That's basically the approach. It should be a pragmatic approach rather than a dogmatic approach or a religious approach. We're not looking to study exactly what the Communist Party did so that we can copy it exactly and prove that we are the Communist Party's true inheritors. We're not looking to operate in that form. Instead, we are looking to study the history so we can learn from it, so we can learn to analyze, learn how things are approached. That's the way we do things. So with that in mind, I'm going to highlight some of the history of Marxist and revolutionary groups in America. Really, I would argue that there are two periods in American history where you had mass movements of people that are trying to do what we are trying to do. And those two periods were, you had the 1930s and the Communist Party, and you had the 1970s and the new communist movement. Now, there were many different socialist and progressive movements throughout American history, but really only the 1930s Communist Party and really only the new communist movement in the 1970s had the understanding that we have. The understanding that capitalism leads to a long-term economic crisis and a breakdown, overproduction, tendency of the rate of profits to fall, that leads toward fascism, that people around the world are struggling against U.S. imperialism, that our goal is to build a united front within the United States, to build a new society, to defeat U.S. imperialism. That understanding you really only had in the Communist Party and in the various new communist movement organizations of the 1970s, which included the Black Panthers. And when we talk about the Communist Party of the United States, we're talking about an organization that gave voice to movements and expressions that were already in the United States. The main thing that the Communist Party gave voice to was the labor movement, the labor unions, right? In the United States, there were labor unions. Workers would go out on strike to demand better wages and better conditions. They would organize unions, and unions were outlawed in a number of states, and the military was sent in to attack striking workers, and there was a whole struggle in the United States for labor unions going out. You had the railroad strike of 1877. That was like a national emergency. To this day, it is the biggest strike in American history. And railroad workers all throughout America went on strike to demand union representation, and they lost. And it was a bloodbath. A lot of people got killed. You had many different progressive labor struggles in American history. Before the First World War in America, you had the big labor federation was called the American Federation of Labor, the AFL. And most labor unions in the United States were part of the AFL. The AFL was started by Samuel Gompers. Samuel Gompers had been a Marxist, but he moved away from it and became a reformist. He moved away from it and he became a reformist, and he led, and it was the AFL believed in pure and simple trade unionism, meaning they weren't fighting for socialism. They weren't fighting for any political movement. They were interested in the interests of the workers of their respective place of employment, right? The union that represented the fur and leather workers, they were interested in increasing the wages and the conditions of fur and leather workers. The union that represented the plumbers, they were interested in protecting and increasing the wages of plumbers. And a lot of these unions that were part of the AFL, they were what was called guilds, right? They were part of guilds. And rather than, people just simply signing up for the job and joining the union, it was almost like you did an apprenticeship. It was like a trade where, in order to learn to be a pipe fitter or in order to learn to be a plumber, you went to the union and you did an apprenticeship with a senior pipe fitter or a senior plumber. They taught you how to do it, and then you were allowed into the union. It was skilled trades. They were, that's where they talk about trade unions versus labor unions, right? These were trades or craftsmen, guilds, right? They were labor unions that were for people with a very specific set of training and skill. They had to go through years of apprenticeships. And the way the training was handed out to get into a guild was quite competitive. It was very hard. It was in order to get an apprenticeship, to be taught how to be a plumber, to be taught how to be a bricklayer. It was very much considered to be a privilege, right? And if your father was a bricklayer, you might have the opportunity to become a bricklayer yourself. And, you'd be taught how to be a bricklayer. This is the guilds or the crafts or the skilled trades. This is how they tend to be. And because it was very nepotistic, they tended to be very ethnic in how they operated. Certain ethnic groups were not welcome. Generally, a lot of these crafts unions only allowed white people. They only allowed people who spoke English, and they only allowed people who were born in the United States. Some of them did not even allow Roman Catholics. It was very common for guilds to say, we don't allow Catholics, we don't allow Jews. And it was kind of a nepotistic brotherhood. It was usually only men, right? And women doing these kind of jobs was just unheard of at the time. And it was, you got into the guild, you got into the union, and they taught you the skill. And that was how most of the labor unions in the United States were. They were guilds, etc. And you saw kind of an expansion of the labor movement. You saw, the beginning of like miners' unions during the 1800s. The Molly Maguires, they were Irish American, miners, coal miners, and leading strikes, and there were organized labor among quote unquote non-skilled trades. You started to see that. The biggest expression of that came in the form of something that was called the IWW. And they were the exact opposite of the American Federation of Labor. The American Federation of Labor was very exclusive. Their unions tended to discriminate. Their unions tended to be only for, people of certain demographics. The IWW, the Industrial Workers of the World, the industrial, the I that stood for industrial, that meant anyone who creates anything, right? Anybody. You're on the assembly line. You're in a steel mill making steel. You are an industry. You're a worker. You're a meat packer. You pack meat. Well, you're an industry. You're a worker. And the IWW, their slogan was one big union, and they wanted a union for all workers. One big union. IWW. And unlike the AFL, it was just for pure and simple trade unionism, the IWW was a revolutionary union. They wanted to overthrow capitalism. And the IWW was this huge organization, and they tended to let anybody join. Anyone could join the IWW. Their slogan was one big union. And they tended to organize the recent immigrants to the United States. There was a wave of immigrants from Northern Europe, Finland, Denmark, the Netherlands. There was a wave of immigrants from Ireland and from Italy and from Eastern Europe. And those folks worked in industries and factories, and they tended to get poverty wages for the work that they did. And the IWW would organize them, and the AFL didn't believe in organizing them. It said they were unskilled workers because they didn't have an apprenticeship on the job, because they just got hired. You're hired, now go work in the steel mill. The AFL said, well, we don't want to be associated with them. Unions are for skilled workers, and it's insulting to us to associate us with these unskilled people. So you had the craft unions, the AFL, and then you had the IWW, the Wobblies. And they were called Wobblies. We don't know why they were called that. That was their nickname, the Wobblies, the IWW. And they said one big union. That's what they were for, one big union. And their ideology was syndicalism, meaning that they did not vote. They were not interested in voting. They were not interested in changing laws. And they wouldn't even sign contracts with their employers. They said if you signed a contract with your boss, that would be recognizing the right of a capitalist to exploit you. So they never signed a contract. And they organized their unions, and they would go on strike. They engaged in sabotage, which was they called a strike on the job, which would be, a message would be delivered to the boss. If you don't start paying people more, some of your machinery might break, or some of your tools might start falling apart, and they would engage in industrial sabotage. That was one thing they were notorious for, was breaking tools, breaking machinery as a way of kind of threatening the employer. And the IWW, they believed in one big union, and they tended to organize the poorest of the poor. And they tended to organize. There was a lot of migrant workers in the United States. People would go from town to town, lumberjacks. They would go from camp to camp in the Pacific Northwest, in Seattle, Portland, Washington State, and Oregon. There was a lot of lumberjacks, and they would go from camp to camp, and they would get ripped off. And so the IWW would organize them. If they went someplace and worked for a week, being told they were going to get paid, if they didn't get paid, well, the IWW would get all those strong lumberjacks together, and they'd go to the boss's house, and they'd break the door down and demand he pay them. There are many examples of things like that, where there were these migrant workers who would be very badly treated. And very badly exploited. And the IWW would organize them to engage in direct action. direct action on the job to get better treatment. And they were sticking up. These migrant workers, they were, they were treated, with no respect. They were treated like vagrants, like homeless people. They would work and then not get paid, and they would be horrendously treated. And so the IWW became this association that fought for the rights of the desperately poor migrant workers, of the miners in Colorado, of the immigrants from Italy and New Jersey who worked in textile factories making poverty wages, the lumberjacks, these jobs that were considered to be unskilled. That is who the IWW would organize. And the IWW, one thing that they were famous for is they had what were called free speech fights. And this is actually quite relevant to what's going on nowadays. But it tended to be that many of the towns around the United States didn't want to have wobbly organizers in their town. They didn't want the wobblies to come and organize the workers to demand better pay from their employers, etc. So they would pass a law in their city, a city ordinance banning agitation or radical speech, etc. They would ban it. There would be a ban. Like, within city limits, we do not allow any radical speeches, or we don't allow any agitators, or we don't allow any yelling over. If your voice is over a certain magnitude, if you're yelling too much, we'll arrest you. And so in many of these little towns and cities, the wobblies would do what they called a free speech fight. And that was what would happen. Was this city would say, in the city of some city in Washington or California or Oregon or Colorado or someplace like that, they'd say no socialist or agitational speech in that city. So they would put an ad in their magazine, and all the wobblies from all over the country, thousands and thousands of people, would come to this little town. And one by one, they would get arrested. And, one person would get up and start giving a speech, and the police would arrest him. Another person would get up and start giving a speech, and the police would arrest him. And another person would get up and start giving a speech, and the police would arrest him. And pretty soon that town's jails would be full of people. And on top of that, these are people coming in from out of town. There's a lot of rough radicals. Before they got arrested for their speech, some windows might get broken. Some property destruction might happen. There'd be some looting of stores. And this would go on. In some cases, it went on for months. And they would just get up and, they would continue to get arrested for their free speech, for exercising their free speech. They would continue to harass this town until finally the city would give in and change the law and say, all right, you can have public speaking. And they did this all over the country. Spokane, Washington was the biggest one. The Spokane free speech fight was the biggest one. And it went on for months and months and months. Thousands of people got arrested in Spokane, Washington. And they did this everywhere. And it was about free speech. It was about the right to stand on a street corner and preach about class struggle and preach socialism. And that was what the Wobblies were famous for. And they had songs. Joe Hill was this famous songwriter. He was born in Finland. I believe, was it Finland or Sweden, someplace like that. And he was a songwriter, and he rewrote a lot of the hymns. There was a lot of street preachers back then. The Salvation Army would go around street preaching. Well, Joe Hill would rewrite the songs of the Salvation Army to be about class struggle. If you listen to a lot of the songs of Joe Hill, they're songs of the street preachers that he would rewrite to be about the workers fighting the bosses and rising up for socialism. That was the IWW. And the IWW, they were notorious for engaging in very, very radical activities and getting arrested. And there were some wealthy people who were interested in communism and Marxism who were sympathetic to the IWW. John Reed, he went to Harvard University. He was this famous writer, this famous American journalist, but he did fundraisers on Broadway to raise money for the Wobblies. There were a lot of intellectuals who liked the Wobblies because they liked Marxism and socialism. But ultimately, the Wobblies, they were not a political movement. They did not vote. They did not try to change the laws. They preached the idea that eventually one day there'd be a great general strike. The workers would just go out on strike in one fell swoop and seize the factories from the bosses. And that this was kind of the Armageddon that they believed in. And it's interesting. This is called syndicalism. And this is what they call the ultra-left school of Marxism. It's connected with anarchism. Noam Chomsky calls himself an anarcho-syndicalist. And it's the idea that they're not interested in political power. They're not interested in anything but the economic struggle of the workers on the job. And they want to create a society where, where the factories belong to the workers. And they also believe there's going to be some kind of great apocalyptic event, some great explosion, a great general strike that will happen. And George Sorel, who is, was a very important French intellectual, who was a huge influence on fascism. Benito Mussolini said George Sorel was his intellectual mentor. George Sorel was one of the leading syndicalists in Europe. And a lot of the syndicalist groups, because they were obsessed with action, they weren't interested in politics. They were interested in action and violence. A lot of them took some very strange positions, right? A lot of in Europe, especially, you had a lot of syndicalist groups that, would admire ancient Greece and ancient Rome. They would talk about, they would say anti-Semitic things and all that. Syndicalism was this wing of politics that was very obsessed with action. But it was the more radical wing. And the American Federation of Labor, the AFL, was very, very conservative. And then you also had the Socialist Party, right? Eugene Debs had been a member of the AFL, been the leader of the railroad workers' strike. He'd gone to prison. And after Eugene Debs got out of prison, he became kind of a born-again socialist. And he went from town to town preaching socialism, and he ran for president on a socialist ticket. And you had a socialist party in America. It was a very loose association. All kinds of people were in it who just vaguely believed in some form of socialism. And you had the Socialist Party. And it was a wide variety of different things. The AFL, pure and simple trade unionism. You had the Socialist Party. You had various religious groups that were concerned about the poor and social justice. You had the IWW that was, leading the desperately poor workers and fighting for them on the job. And, in the lead up to World War I, there was a lot of labor unrest in the United States. There were a lot of strikes. There were a lot of protests. In 1912, Eugene Debs ran for president, and he almost got 1 million votes. He got 900,000 votes, almost 1 million votes. Almost 1 million people voted for Eugene Debs, this socialist agitator. In order to take votes away from Debs, the capitalists, they had the Democrat Party and the Republican Party. They formed another party called the Bull Moose Party, or the Progressive Party, headed by Theodore Roosevelt. And it was to take votes away from Eugene Debs. So the Bull Moose Party kind of vaguely claimed to be a socialist party. In its platform, it said our goal is to expropriate the capitalists, have an America for the working man or something like that. But it was very pro-imperialist, and it didn't even really get into detail about it. But you even had like a fake socialist party set up, the Bull Moose Party, to take votes away. And even then, the Socialist Party got 900,000 votes in the election. And the candidate who won only got I believe, Wilson won the election. He only got 12 million votes. So if you think about that, the amount of influence that the Socialist Party had, and the fact that they had to form a fake Socialist Party to take votes away from them, and the fact that even then they still almost got 1 million votes, that shows you how influential they were. And the Wobblies were everywhere. And, and you had, the various socialist movements, and that most cities had a socialist marching band. There'd be a marching band that would show up and perform and march up and down the street to support striking workers. There were choirs, they'd have socialist choirs. There were socialist baseball teams. There were socialist football and soccer teams. There were socialist kindergartens and socialist daycare centers. And there was just this whole movement of people that believed in socialism. And it was very diverse. And you had the Wobblies, and you had the IWW, you had the Socialist Party, you had a lot of different kind of groups vaguely talking about socialism. And, the most reformist elements in the socialist movement were those that were tied in with the American Federation of Labor, were those that were, tied in with some of the wealthier people. In New England, you had a lot of, old Puritan type people that were exploring socialistic ideas, but wanted to vote for the Democrats, and the Republicans weren't interested in radical ideas. And then the most radical elements were the poorest of the poor, the Wobblies, right? They were the poor, the desperately poor immigrants, who a lot of whom didn't speak English, who led militant strikes, who refused to vote. They were the most radical. It was the more well-off middle-class intellectuals. They were the reformists, and it was the most radical folks. They were the poorest, and that was how the socialist movement was. And it was very much an urban phenomenon. It tended to be in major cities, but not exclusively. In Oklahoma, you had, something called the Working Class Union that was aligned with the Wobblies. And, in Colorado and in other states, you had, rural workers. You had farmers associations that believed in socialism. It was a widespread movement. So when World War I broke out, the U.S. government used World War I to just completely smash the socialist groups, to just completely crush them. And they outlawed the Socialist Party's magazine. There was a famous Supreme Court ruling, Schenck versus the United States. A socialist organizer named Schenck, he was in New York City passing out leaflets, and he said that if you're drafted, don't go and fight. And he was arrested for that. And that's where the Supreme Court, there's this saying you hear in the United States about how, don't shout fire in a crowded theater. That comes from that. They basically said, well, no, there's a clear and present danger. This guy was telling people not to go fight and defend our country in the middle of a war. And the Supreme Court upheld this guy going to prison for handing out leaflets saying, don't fight in World War I. And the IWW was smashed by the government. Eugene Debs was thrown in prison for a speech he gave in Canton, Ohio, an anti-war speech. And the socialist groups were pretty well smashed after World War I. And as we know, the Russian Revolution happened during World War I. And there were a lot of socialists in America that thought very highly of the Russian Revolution. And there were a lot of Russian-speaking socialists in America. And after the Russian Revolution, when it became clear that the Bolsheviks in the Soviet Union were going to form a new, communist international, there were a number of Americans who wanted to get involved and wanted to join the Communist Party. And they were people from the IWW, largely. People from that lower level wing of the labor movement, the more radical wing of the labor movement, the more impoverished workers, recent immigrants. And it was completely illegal. And there was the Palmer raids. Timoshenko's talking about the Palmer raids. Thousands of immigrants who believed in communism were rounded up and deported from the United States. And there was heavy FBI repression. It was completely illegal to be a supporter of the Soviet Union, to be tied to the Communist International. Everything these people did was completely clandestine and secret. And it was focused on building more radical labor unions. Now, as the 1920s went on, there were a lot of people who went to the Soviet Union and liked it. There were a lot of intellectuals, middle-class people who liked the Soviet Union. There was a very famous writer. His name is escaping me. Lincoln Steffens. A guy named Lincoln Steffens. He was a famous muckraker journalist who exposed the crimes of big business. Lincoln Steffens. Well, he went to the Soviet Union. When he came back from the Soviet Union, there were all these reporters there to meet him when he got off the boat. And they said, what did you think of the Soviet Union? And he said, I've seen the future and it works. I've seen the future and it works. And I think Prince, Prince? Yeah. One of the 1980s, 1980s musicians. He has a whole, I've seen the future and it works. And that's a reference to that, right? Because that's what Lincoln Steffens said about the Soviet Union. The Soviet Union said that imperialism was the main enemy and they were opposed to colonialism. There were a lot of black people in the United States who really liked that. Black nationalists were sympathetic to the Soviet Union. They saw the Soviet Union was supporting the decolonization of Africa, and so they were sympathetic to it. And there were a number of Caribbean American intellectuals who were sympathetic to the Soviet Union. So the Soviet Union emerging as a country that was proclaiming a belief in revolutionary Marxism, and that existing, kind of gave some space for the Communist Party to be more than just these radical labor unionists. It kind of created a wing, an understanding the Communist Party was kind of the American incarnation of this global movement that was led by the Soviet Union. But in the 1920s, the U.S. economy started booming again. World War I had happened. There'd been mass destruction. The U.S. economy was booming again. They called it the Roaring 20s. So during the Roaring 20s, there was still a socialist movement, and there was still, you had the garment workers of New York City were striking for better wages, and you had miners on strike, and they were very poor. But the Communist Party was still pretty weak and fringe. It wasn't until the Great Depression happened that the Communist Party really started rapidly expanding. And that was because the Communist Party started building the unemployment councils. There were many, many people who were desperately poor and starving. And so the Communist Party formed these unemployment councils that would have huge demonstrations of thousands and thousands of desperately poor people. And they would storm into the offices of the government and demand worker wages now. They would get arrested en masse. They would confront government officials. And you read about the hunger marches, they were called, the hunger marches, or the unemployed rallies that the Communist Party organized. And it was very poor, desperate people going to government offices and demanding wages and demanding food, demanding jobs. You have to keep in mind, people were actually starving to death during the Great Depression. It was a long-term capitalist crisis. It was the biggest capitalist crisis and the longest lasting capitalist crisis that had ever been seen up until that point, right? There had never been a capitalist crisis that lasted so long. Usually the economy was cyclical, and there would be a boom, and then there'd be a bust and a depression, and then we go back to a boom. But the Great Depression wasn't resolving itself. It was a long-term economic crisis because of the technological leaps that had come. It was a problem of overproduction. And these desperately poor, hungry folks had nowhere to go. And the Communist Party became the place where they would be organized. And the slogan that they used was "Don't starve, fight." And all over the country, the Communist Party organized these unemployment councils, and they were very, very popular. And it was almost like a military formation. They would have like a captain, and there'd be a captain of the unemployed in this region, and they would coordinate. They would have national days of action on Washington. And they would get hundreds of thousands of desperately poor people to Washington, D.C. And I mean, it was very well organized and effective. They organized the veterans, the famous Bonus Army or the Bonus March. And the Communist Party had a lot of support among desperately poor people and among starving and poor people. And it was on that basis that then, the Communist Party was able to kind of start organizing its own labor federation called the Trade Union Unity League. It was the TUUL, which was considered their opposition to the American Federation of Labor. It was their alternative. And the TUUL, the Trade Union Unity League, was extremely, extremely radical. It had, socialism in the United States. It had 10 points of what it believed in. One of them was socialism in the United States. And another one was recognizing and aligning with the Soviet Union. Like, it was a very, very radical organization. And the TUUL, and they led strikes of coal miners and strikes of all kinds of workers around the country, textile workers in the South. That was what the Communist Party was. It was very much an expression of the low-wage workers, of workers who were considered unskilled and were not organized by the American Federation of Labor, workers who English was not their first language, workers who were not born in the United States, desperately poor people who were starving during the Great Depression and needed to be heard. And the Communist Party, aligned with the Soviet Union, was their voice in American politics. That's really what it was. And it led them in hunger marches. It led them in labor union organizing and strikes. And it was aligned with the Soviet Union. And its stated goal was to overthrow capitalism and to establish the United Soviet States of America, the USSA, they called it, the United Soviet States of America. And that's what they wanted to do. And they were a mass movement. Then, while maybe they only had 80, 90,000 members, they represented millions of people. The communists in the neighborhood, they knew everybody. If there was going to be an unemployed demonstration, they could get thousands and thousands of people, whole neighborhoods, whole blocks to turn out. They knew what they were doing. That was the Communist Party. And then, as it became clear that the ruling class of the United States wanted to overthrow Roosevelt. And as it became clear, there was a danger of fascism in the United States, and that there was a section of the American government that wanted to support Hitler, the Communist Party entered a strategic alliance with Roosevelt. And when they entered a strategic alliance with Roosevelt, they were a bloc, right? They represented the Soviet Union. They represented the desperately poor people. And they were the basis of kind of an anti-fascist alliance, the Popular Front, they called it. A lot of intellectuals, a lot of writers, a lot of Hollywood folks were supporting Roosevelt and supporting the Soviet Union and saying that Hitler was bad. Saying that Hitler was bad, Hitler was no good. Mussolini was bad, Mussolini was no good. The Soviet Union, on the other hand, they were pretty good. Roosevelt was a good guy. Unions and organized labor, they were good. And that was a big current in the United States. And yeah, the most dedicated folks were in the Communist Party, but it was a really big layer of people. Dr. Seuss. You ever read Dr. Seuss? Right? You ever read, I will not eat green eggs and ham. I will not eat them, Sam I am. He was one of these people. He was never in the Communist Party, but he made cartoons defending Stalin. He, very much voted for Roosevelt, and his book Horton Hears a Who was about the Spanish Republic and how no one was supporting them. And that Dr. Seuss, he was just a Jewish guy from New York City, and everyone in his neighborhood supported Roosevelt, and everyone in his neighborhood thought the Soviet Union wasn't so bad and thought that labor unions were good, and that this was just a big part. This was a big chunk of the U.S. population. It varied. Obviously, you had a lot of people in the South that liked Roosevelt and didn't like Hitler, but also had really, really racist beliefs, right? And they were not interested in communism or labor unions, right? You had the Dixiecrat wing of the Democratic Party. And then it was a spectrum. There was a spectrum. But this whole kind of layer of U.S. society that you call the Popular Front that was aligned with Roosevelt, that was thinking the Soviet Union were not so bad, that was thinking Hitler and Mussolini were evil and dangerous, was thinking that labor unions were a good thing. We needed more labor unions, that were happy that Roosevelt passed unemployment insurance, that were happy that Roosevelt created Social Security. This was a big layer of U.S. society. And the Communist Party was like the most radical and most dedicated faction within it. And that was what the Communist Party was. And they did everything as a tactic. They understood that eventually they wanted the United States to be like the Soviet Union, to become the United Soviet States of America. They were doing it as a tactic. They were polarizing U.S. society, and they figured that eventually it would get to the point that the fascists would try to overthrow Roosevelt, and Roosevelt would call the American workers out in the streets to defend him, and there would be some kind of revolution, and the Communist Party would sit at the center of like a new government that would come to power in Washington, D.C. And if you look at the way things were going during the 1930s, you can see that was a real possibility, right? I mean, if you never want to get into like a what if this and what if that, historical hypothetical, but you could see something like that happening. If the economic crisis of the 1930s had continued indefinitely, if Roosevelt had faced just an all-out onslaught from the capitalist class, and if Roosevelt had the strength to then, the intelligence to then call on the workers out in the streets to defend him, to appeal to the Soviet Union for support, you could see those conditions leading to a socialist United States. When you had this huge block of the population that was kind of sympathetic to what the communists had to say, you had a president who was kind of sympathetic, and then that president was under attack by a pro-fascist movement among his own class. You could see that something like a revolution could have developed out of that. Now, what happened instead was you had World War II. And during World War II, Roosevelt got more radical. He got friendly with Stalin. He called for an economic Bill of Rights. Henry Wallace was the vice president, and Henry Wallace said that World War II was, he talked about the century of the common man, and he compared the American Revolution and the Russian Revolution to each other and said it was a battle for the common man. And, but as World War II came to an end, Roosevelt died. Harry Truman got in there. And as World War II came to an end, it became very clear that the USA was not going to be friends with the Soviet Union after World War II. The atomic bomb on Hiroshima and Nagasaki that was not militarily necessary. Japan offered to surrender, and the USA said no. And then it bombed them at Hiroshima and Nagasaki, and then it accepted the exact same deal afterwards. So it was not necessary. It was simply to send a message to the Soviet Union that the United States had the atomic bomb. It was a threat on the Soviet Union. It was to demonstrate, to the Soviet Union that the USA did have the atomic bomb. That was why Hiroshima and Nagasaki were bombed. And after World War II, Roosevelt was dead, but there was a huge purge of the Democratic Party, and all the Roosevelt Democrats were being purged. Roosevelt's name was run through the mud. They said that Roosevelt had given Eastern Europe over to Stalin, and he'd sold Eastern Europe down the river to Stalin. And you had the Korean War, and you had McCarthyism. It was in that atmosphere the Communist Party of the United States was just crushed. I mean, it was really, really crushed. The FBI went after them, and the leaders all went to federal prison, and the Communist Party of the United States was just crushed. And the USA had a booming economy, and the economy was booming. And because the economy was booming, average Americans, they didn't want to, they were not interested in class struggle anymore. They could get a house in the suburbs, and they can get a good paying job. So a lot of people who'd been friendly to the Communist Party, now their living standard was going up, and they were not interested. Plus, there was this new, I talk about this new brainwashing machine called a television that was pumping Americans up with fear of communism. And because of all of that, the Communist Party was isolated, and it was down to about 10,000 members. There were about 10,000 people who were very, very loyal to the Communist Party, and they were not going to leave, and they went to prison, and they lost their jobs, and they went through hell. And then in 1956, Khrushchev gave his secret speech and threw Stalin under the bus and said that all the things that the U.S. media had said about Stalin were all true. And so then 2/3 of those people quit. And since then, the Communist Party was down to a tiny organization. I mean, it was irrelevant after that. The Communist Party was basically wiped out by McCarthyism. And then the final bullet, was Khrushchev's secret speech. And after that, the Communist Party was not relevant. They were a very, very small group of people that were taking instructions from the Soviet Union. And that was the tragedy of history, that they had built up during a period of an economic crisis. They had built themselves up in a period of an economic crisis, in a period of an alliance between the United States and the Soviet Union. And the economy changed, and the global situation changed, and it led to a situation. And then ultimately the Soviet Union betrayed them, and they had been saying that Stalin was good and that Stalin was the leader of the world socialist movement. And then the head of the Soviet Union himself came out and said, oh, Stalin was no good. Everything American media said about Stalin was true. And that destroyed the Communist Party. And that was really the first wave of communism in the United States, right? Is the Communist Party. Now, the next wave is the new communist movement. And I talked about that on my previous stream, but I'm going to talk about it again. The new communist movement, it was a breakaway from the new left, right? And this is where it gets really interesting. So Khrushchev gave his secret speech. McCarthyism had broken apart the Communist Party, but there were divisions in the ruling class. And, if you want to know about these divisions in the ruling class, the book you really ought to get your hands on is The Yankee and Cowboy War, Conspiracies from Dallas to Watergate. Right? Very good question. So there was a division in the ruling class. After the Second World War, During the Second World War, the USA had stimulated the economy and gotten the economy rolling again with military spending. And after the Second World War, because of the Cold War with the Soviet Union, the US government started spending millions and millions of dollars on weaponry. And with the NATO, they were selling weapons to all the European countries, and they were arming, South Korea and South Vietnam, and the USA was selling weapons all over the world. And the US government was spending lots of money on weapons, and weapons and militarism became a big part of the US economy. And the hard right wing in the United States was very much the weapons manufacturers. Dwight Eisenhower, when he was leaving office, in his speech, he warned about the unwarranted influence of the military-industrial complex. And you had the military-industrial complex, this big section of U.S. society that was obsessed with making money from war. And those folks, they wanted a military conflict with the Soviet Union. Whereas there was a soft power strategic wing. There were all these think tanks in New England, the Council on Foreign Relations and the Round Table Group and the Ford Foundation. The higher levels of capital had a strategy for fighting communism. And they saw the Korean War, and they saw McCarthyism, and their strategy for fighting communism was a more long-term strategy. They said we can fight communism by carefully kind of inserting our ideas into the Soviet Union and undermining people in the Soviet Union and their loyalty to communism. We can fight communism by, fixing the situation for African Americans in the United States and improving conditions for Black people in America. We can fight communism by operating covertly and, having proxy fighters around the world. But this strategy of having big, huge wars like the Korean War and the Vietnam War, where the USA just goes in there and kills millions of people and bombs the place, that's not going to work. And that actually helps the communists. When Martin Luther King Jr. is organizing for civil rights and we just call him a communist, that helps the communists. And when these countries around the world are aligned with the United States, are kept in chronic poverty, that helps the communists. And so if you look at like the Kennedy administration, their strategy was more, it was, we're going to have a civil rights movement to kind of start to improve the situation of African Americans in the United States. We're going to use the CIA to wage coups, etc. We're going to kind of put pressure and help countries like South Korea and Iran to industrialize and, have some higher living standards and do some land reform. That way it'll kind of steal the thunder of the communists around the world. And at the same time, we're going to start covertly funding like the New Left and manipulating the communists and kind of seeping Western liberal ideas into the Soviet Union. And that's like the long-term strategy for the defeating the communists. Whereas the military-industrial complex, they hated the civil rights movement because they thought, the communists believe in racial equality, so it must be a communist conspiracy. And, the military-industrial complex said we ought to just have big, huge wars. After the Bay of Pigs invasion, right? And after the Cuban exiles went down to Cuba and got defeated by the Cuban government. After that happened, they wanted Kennedy to go in and invade Cuba. And Kennedy wasn't going to do it. He didn't think it was strategic. And so it was clear that there was a division within the ruling class about the civil rights movement, about whether or not the Vietnam War should blow up into a full-on confrontation. There was a division within the ruling class about how should the United States respond to the spreading of communism around the world. Should the United States become like a hardline military dictatorship and have big, huge wars and just lock down and suppress the Black freedom movement and continue McCarthyism? Or should the United States loosen up as a society, start allowing civil rights for African Americans, not do so much militarism, and start developing a culture of, sex, drugs, and rock and roll, and just kind of present itself as a homeland of freedom and kind of create, a loose liberal culture that will, kind of slip into the socialist countries and create unrest. And that was the division. And it's very clear the CIA, with the Congress for Cultural Freedom program and all of that, they were on one side, and the military-industrial complex was on another side. And there was a division in the ruling class, and the ruling class were fighting against each other. And the John Birch Society and the White Citizens Councils and Richard Nixon were on one side, and the Kennedy administration and the NAACP and a lot of liberal organizations, the Senate, the Institute for Policy Studies, the IPS, the Institute for Policy Studies, and all kinds of institutions were created that pushed, the CIA point of view. The CIA started distributing drugs with Project MK Ultra. There was a huge effort to promote Eastern religions because, like, mystical Eastern religions were anti-communist. John Foster Dulles, the CIA's founder, he said that the CIA needed to pour money into mystical Eastern religions because they were the antidote to communism. And so, like, Buddhism was being funded by the CIA, and and Hinduism and the Hare Krishna movement, and they were funding Eastern mystical religions and drugs. And the CIA had one strategy for defeating the communists, and the military-industrial complex had another strategy. And in order to play out this fight, you had something called the New Left. The New Left were not communists. The New Left, they were not interested in labor unions. They did not believe in class struggle. They were a movement of nonconformists. They didn't like militarism. They were into mystical stuff. It's the hippie movement, basically. And it was nonconformity. You had the Frankfurt School. It was started by Herbert Marcuse. Herbert Marcuse had been a U.S. intelligence agent. He'd worked for the U.S. Department of Information during the Second World War, and then he became the big Marxist after World War II. Theodore Adorno, and his work that was commissioned. And the New Left, it was rock and roll. It was, let's not be so uptight and militaristic, and, let's loosen up American society. Let's support the civil rights movement. The way to defeat the communists is not through, being like them and being authoritarian. The way to defeat the communists is to, like, hang loose, man, and loosen up everything. That's the New Left. And the New Left and the military-industrial complex were clashing with each other. There was a fight going on. And when the capitalists fight with one another, that opens the door to the working class. And a lot of working class people got political. And a lot of young Americans that liked rock and roll and liked the civil rights movement, they got involved in protesting against the Vietnam War. They got involved in civil rights. But in Vietnam, the communists kept winning. And there was a layer of the New Left. And this is where it gets interesting. There were some people in the New Left that became communists, that just because there was so much communism around the world, because China was having the Cultural Revolution, because the Soviet Union existed, because the Vietnamese were communists, there was a layer of younger people that were involved in the New Left that became communists, right? You had, for example, one of the big civil rights activist groups was called the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, SNCC. Well, among organizers in SNCC, that it was an African-American civil rights group, among organizers in SNCC, there was an attempt to form a more radical version of the Communist Party. It was called the RAM, the Revolutionary Action Movement. And there was a number of members of Students for a Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, and they met in Ohio. They had a secret meeting at a college, and they formed something called the Revolutionary Action Movement. And they were a Black-only communist Marxist-Leninist organization. And actually the Black Panthers, the founders of the Black Panthers, Huey Newton and Bobby Seale, they had been involved in RAM. And they didn't feel like RAM was really going anywhere. They felt like it was just kind of a talk shop. So they broke away from RAM and they formed the Black Panthers. And the Black Panthers, if you look at their heritage, it comes out of the New Left. You had the Civil Rights Movement, the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee. Within SNCC, you had like a secret communist faction called RAM. And two guys in RAM, Bobby Seale and Huey Newton, said, we're going to do the Black Panther thing. Students for a Democratic Society, SDS, when it started, SDS was an anti-communist organization. It banned any communist from joining the organization. It said it wanted a participatory democracy. It was funded by Upton Sinclair. Upton Sinclair had started something called the League for Industrial Democracy. And so there was something called Students for Industrial Democracy. It was like the youth wing of it. And they were young people that were involved in labor unions, and they supported the civil rights movement. So then they formed Students for a Democratic Society. And it was funded by the United Auto Workers Union. And it was a group of young people who supported the civil rights movement, who didn't want the USA to escalate in Vietnam, and no communist was allowed to join it. And if you read the Port Huron Statement, like the founding document of Students for a Democratic Society, it's not very radical. It's very liberal. It was like DSA. Students for a Democratic Society was a lot like DSA. And in fact, some of the people that started DSA were members of it, right? Tom Hayden and I'm trying to think of various names. Tom Hayden and who else? And who is it? Tom Hayden. The names are escaping me. And Michael, what's his name? Oh goodness, it was Tom Hayden. Was a founder of Students for a Democratic Society, and then there were a number of people involved in it. The names are escaping me. There was. Goodness gracious. Tom Hayden is the name that comes to my mind. He eventually married Jane Fonda, but there's some other people. There's Michael something or other. I can't remember his name. He was the founder of DSA. He eventually became the founder of DSA. Michael something or other. He was a Shachtmanite Trotskyist. Who is it? Michael Harrington. And he was a founder of Students for a Democratic Society. And they were just this kind of social democratic liberal organization. No communist was allowed to join. And they supported the civil rights movement. They were against the Vietnam War and against militarism. But if you look over the course of the 60s, by 1969, SDS was a full-on Maoist communist-dominated group. The Progressive Labor Party, one group of Maoist communists, fought for control of it against the Revolutionary Youth Movement, the Weathermen, that were another faction. And it was by the end of the 1960s, Students for a Democratic Society had gone from this kind of very moderate social democratic group to being like a Maoist communist organization and marching with the flag of the Vietnamese, etc. And so among the New Left, there was a layer of people that were part of the New Left that started reading about the Communist Party, read about William Z. Foster, read about the 1930s and what the Communist Party had done, and they wanted to form a new party that would be like the Communist Party had been during the 1930s. And there were a number of different groups, and they tried to form a new communist party. And that was the New Communist Movement, the NCM. And what made them different from the rest of the New Left was that they made a decision to break with the New Left. They cut their hair. They had short hair. They got jobs in factories. They didn't use drugs. They looked mainly to China for inspiration, also to Cuba, also to North Korea and Vietnam and different countries. And they very much, they had an understanding that they didn't believe in counterculture. They didn't believe in the hippies. They realized that a revolution in the United States would require going to the working class. It would require the broad masses of Americans becoming communist. That's the NCM, the New Communist Movement. And there's a number of history books about them. You can read, last night I highlighted this book, Heavy Radicals, the FBI's War on America's Maoists. There's some other books you can read about them. If you really want to know about the history of the New Communist Movement, there's a book you can read called Revolution in the Air. 60s radicals turned to Lenin, Mao, and Che. And that's by Max Elbaum. And he was part of it. And he wrote a history of the New Communist Movement. But there's others. Let me see. There's let me see here. There's others. There's a book about the New Communist Movement. Oh, here's one. This is about in Detroit. This is called Detroit, I Do Mind Dying. And it's about how there was actually, this is probably one of the most successful areas of the New Communist Movement. In the 1970s, a number of African Americans that were interested in communism got jobs in factories, and they formed something called the League of Revolutionary Black Workers, or the Dodge Revolutionary Union Movement. And they kind of ran Detroit during the 1970s. They got a Maoist communist judge elected. They got Coleman Young, the first black mayor of Detroit, who had been like very close to the Communist Party USA. They got him elected mayor of Detroit. Like one of the most famous people in Detroit during this time was a lawyer named Ken Cockrell. And Ken Cockrell, he was this radical lawyer, and, the Black Panthers had murdered some heroin dealers who were distributing heroin, and he got them acquitted after they killed these heroin dealers. And, there was a black worker who'd been wrongfully fired from his job. So he showed up at work and shot his boss, and he got him acquitted. Jimmy Johnson, it was a famous case. And that, the League of Revolutionary Black Workers and the Dodge Revolutionary Union movement. And there was a newspaper called South End Press that was like one of the main newspapers in Detroit. They had a lot of influence and power in Detroit during the 1970s, even up into the 80s. And there's a lot of interesting history of the NCM, the New Communist Movement. And it's worth looking into. And the New Communist Movement was very much, they were out of the movement to the masses. And they really took that seriously. And at some points, they went over the top with it. They used to joke that the Revolutionary Communist Party, that they, you'd be at a meeting and it would go around to different people, what organization are you with? Well, I'm Joe Bob. I'm with the Communist Party. And I'm Steve. I'm with the New York City Committee to Stop the War. I'd get to the person from the Revolutionary Communist Party. He'd say, I'm just an ordinary working man. They went over the top a little bit in their worker fetish. And, there were some examples of the Revolutionary Communist Party, and some of these Maoist groups were they were working so hard to not be part of the hippie counterculture. They did some things that were mistakes. For example, they supported the racist riots in Boston, right? In Boston, there were riots against school integration. And these communists, they were so against the new left, and they wanted to get out of the movement to the masses. In the name of that, they made the mistake of supporting the racist anti-busing, riots. In West Virginia, the school textbooks were teaching Darwin's theory of evolution. This was in like the mid 70s. And a lot of the folks in Appalachia are evangelical Christians, and they didn't approve of that. And so they had the textbook riots. You can read about the textbook riots, in West Virginia, the textbook riots. It was very famous. Right. 1974, Kanawha County textbook controversy. And, it was this right-wing mobilization, and they were mad. It wasn't just Darwinian evolution. They didn't like the quotes from Sigmund Freud. They didn't like quotes about Malcolm X. It was a right-wing mobilization, against the school textbooks for being too liberal. And the Revolutionary Communist Party, they supported it on the grounds. They said it was like self-determination. These are working class people. They don't like the government and these wealthy liberals trying to tell them what their kids are going to learn in school. And the Revolutionary Communist Party supported the textbook riots, in West Virginia, on the grounds, this was a working class thing. This is how dedicated they were to getting out of the movement to the masses. And unfortunately, that's the mindset that has been lost on the left. There is this understanding now on the left that we always go along with whatever the liberals are doing. Well, the Maoists, the New Communist Movement was smart enough to realize, no, you don't. And so the New Communist Movement of the 70s was very successful. Ultimately, their success, they did it for a decade. And then with the rise of Ronald Reagan and, they collapsed and, they retreated, and there's very little of the New Communist Movement left. The RCP, the Revolutionary Communist Party, still exists. The October League, dissolved. That was a big party that had been formed. And the NCM, the New Communist Movement of the 1970s, is almost a tragedy because these folks were doing the right thing. They knew that the hippie counterculture and the new left wasn't the answer. But at that point, the U.S. economy was still so strong, and you still had this layer of well-paid white workers who just didn't want to hear about communism. We're not interested in communism. So because of that, they just couldn't develop a base. The only place that the new communist movement really was strong was Detroit. Everywhere else in the United States, they were weak. They really just couldn't gain influence among the broad masses of American workers because the U.S. economy was so strong. And then in response to the Iranian Revolution and the Nicaraguan Revolution, you had the rise of Ronald Reagan, and the white workers in America became even more right-wing. And because of that, those folks kind of surrendered. I consider what we're doing with CPI. We're not trying to carry out the line of the new communist movement. We're not Maoists, and we're not trying to restore the Communist Party of the 1930s. But those two groups, the Communist Party of the 1930s and the new communist movement of the 1970s, those are the two trends in American history that did what we were trying to do. And if you read their pamphlets and their writing, they understood things the way we understand them. One, they understood that it will be the broad masses of Americans who will bring socialism to America, not the hippies, not the intellectuals. And, it's not only going to be, the people of color are not going to do it on their own, that the broad masses of white Americans need to be won to an anti-imperialist, revolutionary, Marxist line, right? That is our understanding, that average Americans in Kansas and Idaho and Texas and Pennsylvania and Portland and all throughout America, average Americans need to become communists. There needs to be a mass communist movement, not a counterculture, but the broad masses of Americans. Millions of Americans need to be brought into a communist movement. That's the one thing that we take, that the Communist Party, they understood this during the 1930s, and also the new communist movement understood that during the 1970s. Number two, they understood that capitalism is headed toward an economic crisis rooted in the problem of overproduction, that technology leads to poverty under capitalism. Self-driving cars, as I've explained on other streams, would be a great thing under any other system. But under capitalism, self-driving cars would lead to riots in the streets and poverty. And that capitalism, the more technology advances, the more technology advances, the more efficient it gets to create goods, the poorer people get. This is the problem with capitalism. It leads to an economic crisis. And an economic crisis in capitalism leads the ruling class to move toward fascism. And when the ruling class moves toward fascism, communists position themselves at the center of anti-fascist resistance, and they build a broad movement of the people to resist the drive toward fascism and war. And eventually, that is how communists seek to take power. And if you read Georgy Dimitrov, or you read, in the 1970s, this was clear among the new communist movement. This was clear among the Communist Party of the 1930s, that capitalism, in order to save itself, is moving toward fascism. But communists are to try to build a mass movement of the people to resist fascism, to defend their jobs and wages and living conditions, to oppose the move toward war, and to oppose the move to set up kind of a low-wage police state, and that we are to position ourselves as the champions of the broad masses of Americans against fascism and war. So that's the second thing that we have in common with them. We share a similar understanding of how capitalism works, how an economic crisis leads to a political crisis, and then what you do about it. The third thing is that the new communist movement in the 1970s and the Communist Party in the 1930s both understood that you welcome the defeat of U.S. imperialism. The new communist movement during the Vietnam War, they used to march through the streets with the flags of the Vietnamese National Liberation Front. They used to chant, ho, ho, Ho Chi Minh, the NLF is gonna win. Ho, ho, Ho Chi Minh, the NLF is gonna win. Or they used to chant, one side's right, one side's wrong, victory to the Viet Cong. One side's right, one side's wrong, victory to the Viet Cong. Meaning that they were always on the side of whoever the American imperialists, whoever the American imperialists were targeting, they welcomed the defeat of American imperialism. They weren't just pacifists. They weren't just against the Vietnam War. They supported the Vietnamese people. And that didn't just apply to communists. In 1979, when the Ayatollahs of Iran, the Islamic Revolution, seized the embassy, they supported it. And they said, it's not our embassy. It's the capitalists' embassy. It's Wall Street and the Pentagon. It's Rockefeller's embassy, and we support the Iranian people taking that embassy, and they supported the Iranian hostage takers. They welcomed the defeat of the Pentagon. They welcomed the defeat of Wall Street. They welcomed the defeat of the U.S. imperialist apparatus. They welcomed it because they were on the side of the people of the world, and they saw their role as getting the American working class to align with the Vietnamese, to align with the people of China, to align with the people of Cuba against American imperialism. They were on the side of the forces around the world that were resisting American imperialism, just like Karl Marx said that he was on the side of the Irish people, that the only way the British working class could win its freedom was to align with the Irish freedom struggle and to support all of the Irish people in their fight against the British, even if they were doing so on Catholic grounds, reactionary grounds. If you are a British working class person in Britain and you are up against the British capitalists, you should align yourself with the Irish people who are also fighting against the British capitalists, right? It's called revolutionary defeatism. That if you're against the American imperialist state, if you are organizing the working class to be against the American imperialist state, you should align with the forces around the world that are also fighting the American imperialist state, right? And that was the new communist movement in the 1970s. They understood this. And the Communist Party of the United States during the 1930s, they understood this, right? And so in a lot of ways, if you want to understand what we're doing, you need to look over the history of the Communist Party in the 1930s. You need to look over the history of the new communist movement in the 70s. Read about the Black Panthers. Read about William Z. Foster. Read about the Civil Rights Congress, which was the Black Revolutionary Organization formed by the Communist Party, and Paul Robeson and William L. Patterson. Read about Claudia Jones. This is our movement. And go back to the Wobblies. We can learn from all of this, and that we're doing our own thing in our own time. Let's be absolutely clear about this. We are doing our own thing in our own time. We're not going to copy what these people did. There was no internet during the 1930s. There was no internet in the 1970s. No one was live streaming on YouTube during the Roosevelt years, right? And we're doing something different. And neither of these movements won. Let's remember. The 1930s Communist Party, they came close, and if things had developed a certain way, you can see a situation arising where that could have turned into communism, but they didn't win ultimately, right? And the 1970s Communist movement, they didn't even come close to winning. It was actually quite depressing. Their history was quite depressing because the conditions were just not right. But we can learn from all of this, and that the understanding that we have about the laws of capitalism, why capitalism leads to long-term economic crises like we're currently living under, why that then leads to fascism and war, and how we should align ourselves and how we should operate, that understanding we can hold on to. And ultimately, that's the understanding that brought socialism to the Soviet Union, that brought socialism to China, that brought socialism to Latin America. That understanding, that scientific understanding of the objective laws of history, how the economic crisis creates a political crisis, how in a political crisis, communists can position themselves at the center of a united front. That understanding we take with us in this time, and it's very helpful to what we're doing now. So I wanted to kind of share all that history with all of you, and I wanted to kind of, give you kind of highlights of all of this because I think it's important. I hope this was helpful. Those are my opening remarks for tonight. So hit the like button, hit the subscribe button, hit the notifications bell, and I'm going to do the roll call now. I'm going to call you all out as I see you, names and locations. I'll call you out as I see you. And then from there, right? From there, we will answer super chat questions. So folks have more super chat questions, by all means ask, right? Ask, right? So, there you go. Just pulling something up here, but yeah. There we go. So, all right. Names and locations, folks. Names and locations. I will call you out as I see you. So we got David Muller from Columbia, Illinois. We got Alex from Brazil. We got Tyler from Missouri, my favorite English teacher. We got here from Spain, great stream. Ryan in Kansas City, Temple City, California, St. David's, Bermuda, JT24 in Mississippi. Good stuff, good stuff. Names and locations, folks. Alejandro in California, Joe in South Jersey, UP of Michigan, Amical Cabral, Jenny Lynn in Cincinnati, Patch in Arizona, Boston, Massachusetts, Stephen, Auckland, New Zealand, Heidi in Edinburgh, Scotland, Nate in Chicago, John McCarthy in Chicago, Mark in Mission, Texas, Troy in the Paris of the Plains, Chris from Syracuse, New York, Carolyn and Dario from Brooklyn, Bob Troy in New York, David Rennie from Ontario, Gabo Hernandez in Chicago, AZ, Mike Pino, AZ. All right, we got Elizabeth Y in Oregon. We got George Munoz, is that how I say it? In Sydney, Australia. We got Balthazar in Oakland, Dylan in Seattle. Welcome, everybody. Welcome. Mr. Wonderful from Qantas, Yonatan Mahari in London, Ishmael in Los Angeles. Very good. Curtis in Houston, Texas. Welcome. Kendall in San Diego. Kieran from San Diego. Good stuff. AZ in Arizona. Chris in Salt Lake City. Chris in Houston, Texas. Kendall in San Diego. Very, very good. Very, very good. Names and locations. Anybody? Names and locations. Names and locations. Names and locations. I'll do a few more names and locations. We want to get up Cleveland Pirate Alex, always a favorite, right? Manlet and AZ is Arizona. Very, very good. Vale of Tears, Chris Sawicki. Very good. Chris in Salt Lake City. Klaus in Germany. James from Ontario, Canada. Vale of Tears. Very, very good. Oh, Mindanao to Midwest, Olympia Logic. Good friend of everything we do here. Glad to have you. Glad to have you. So there we go. There we go. All right, folks. Well, I am trying to popularize communist music. That's one thing I've been doing on here. And I also need to open the windows to my room because it's getting a little hot in here. The building I'm in, they like to crank up the heat. So I'm going to put on another Cornelius Cardew song. As I've told you all before, I like Cornelius Cardew's music with my tongue in my cheek. I'm kind of laughing at myself. It's very, very, very communist. Let me put it that way. Cornelius Cardew's music is very, very communist. The lyrics are not the most poetic lyrics ever written, but it's done, to get across. He's heavy with the politics. So I'm going to put on some Cornelius Cardew music, just one song called The Workers' Song by Cornelius Cardew. And then I'm going to answer people's super chat questions. And I'm going to open this window here. So I'm going to answer people's super chat questions. And then from there, that's our show. So if people have more super chats, by all means, send them. I'd love answering people's questions. We got some good ones here already. So there we go. There we go. So let's do the Cardew, The Workers' Song by Cornelius Cardew. Here we go.
I am a worker and I say it with pride. The rich and their system I've always defied. The wealth is created by a class far and wide, but the fruits of our labor are always denied. The system's bad, but it will have to go. I've worked with men from all over the globe. We're all of one class, we share weal and woe. But lately the racists have been launching attacks directed against the entire working class. We must fight, yes, we've got to fight back. Lately my wages have been going right down. The same thing is true for each worker in town. The government has not got our interests at heart. Just keeping alive has become quite an art. They go down, down, yes, wages go down. I went to the union to ask what to do, but the man at headquarters just hadn't a clue. He had a portrait of Callahan, and before it he knelt, and his only advice was to tighten my belt. His speaks for the rich and not for the working man. The cause of all problems is a capitalist class. They cause wars, they cause hardship, and they always blame us with our Marxist-Leninist party to lead. We have the solution. What the working class needs is proletarian revolution.
Yes, that's some of that Cornelius Cardew music. It is an acquired taste. I know it's not the best music in the world, but I'm kind of laughing at myself while I listen to it. But I ask one more thing on that tune you just heard, right? Not the lyrics. The lyrics, that's all Cardew preaching his Enver Hoxha pro-Albania communism. But the song is actually, it's a Scottish labor song, the tune, and it's called "The Coal Owner and the Pitman's Wife." And the lyrics to the original song are actually a little bit better. It's about, well, I'll actually play that original song just because it's short, and you might appreciate that. It's a Scottish labor song about you know, the wife of a coal miner meeting a mine owner. So I'm going to put that on. So you'll hear that tune, but you'll hear the original lyrics, which are also centered around, you know, working class movements and stuff, but it's quite different, right? That was Cornelius Cardew just kind of giving you a standard Marxist rant there. The Marxist-Leninist party to lead. We have the solution that the working class needs, right? But this is the original. I'm going to put it on here. It's downloading now, but it's a very old song too, right? I think it goes back to like the 1810s or something like that. But I'm going to play you the original version. I recommend a song by First Nations Canadian Willie Dunn and his song, "I Pity the Nation." I pity the nation. All right, I put that on the list, and thank you for the super chat. We've got a good list of super chats here to answer, and that's why we're here for. I got to take a little break there, and that's good. You know, it gives me a time to just kind of refresh and come on back. And yeah, this song should be almost ready. And we'll play "The Poor Pitman's Wife" just so you guys know what that song is about, because I think you'll find it amusing. It's, you know, it's certainly going to be amusing. So here we go. All right. This is the original lyrics to the song. Also a working class song, very different theme. And this is here we go. Here we go.
A dialogue, I'll tell you, as true as my life, between a coal owner and a poor pitman's wife. As she was a travelling all on the highway, she met a coal owner, and this she did say: "Derry down, 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 derry down." "Good morning, Lord Firedamp," this woman she said. "I'll do you no harm, sir, don't be afraid. If you'd been where I'd been for most of me life, you wouldn't turn pale at a poor pitman's wife. Derry down, 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 derry down." "Then where have you been?" the owner he cried. "I've been in hell," the poor woman replied. "If you come from hell, then tell me quite plain how you contrived to get out again. Derry down, 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 derry down." "Either way I got out, the truth I will tell. They're turning the poor folk all out of hell. This is to make room for the rich wicked race, but there is a great number of them in that place. Derry down, 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 derry down." And the coal owners is the next on command to arrive in hell, as I understand. For I heard the old devil say as I came out, the coal owners all had received their rout. Derry down, 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 derry down. How does the devil behave in that place? Sir, he is cruel to the rich, wicked race. He is far more cruel than you can suppose. He's like a mad bull with a ring through his nose. Derry down, 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 derry down. If you be an owner, sir, take my advice. Agree with your men and give them a fair price. For if and you do not know very well, you'll be in great danger of going to hell. Derry down, 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 derry down. For all ye coal owners great fortunes has made by those jovial men that works in the coal trade. Now how can you think for to prosper and thrive by wanting to starve your poor workers alive? Derry down, 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 derry down. Good woman, says he, I must bid you farewell. You give me a dismal account about hell. If this be all true that you say unto me, I'll be home like a whippet, with me poor men agree. Derry down, 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 derry down. So come, ye poor pitmen, and join heart and hand, for when you're off work, all trades at a stand. In the town of Newcastle, all cry out amain, all gin at the pits were at work once again. Derry down, 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 derry down. Well, the pit gates are locked, little more I've to say. I was turned out of my house on the 13th of May. But it's now to conclude, and I'll finish my song. I hope you'll relieve me and let me carry on. Derry down, 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 derry down. Derry down, 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 derry down.
So there you go. There you go. That was the original lyrics. So there you go. All right, folks, we got some super chats here to answer. So the first one that I was asked is, do you think the Hunter Biden laptop documents reveal nefarious actions by the Communist Party of China? Do you think that that's the case? Look, China, they are the first to tell you they have an issue with corruption. Xi Jinping has come into office, and one of the things he's done is launched a crackdown against corruption. In attempts to bribe elected officials, to engage in shady, underhanded deals. They've cracked down on it. But is it possible that some companies in China were corrupt in their dealings with Hunter Biden's son? Of course, right? I mean, capitalists are capitalists. Now, in China, the Chinese Communist Party tends to closely try and control their activities. But, is it possible that some capitalist in China, engaged in, some self-interested, underhanded activities with Biden? Of course, that's possible, right? I mean, just because the U.S. mainstream media says it doesn't mean it's true, but I believe it's very possible, right? And and it's also possible that that the Biden administration did this in the hopes of some kind involved in some kind of operation to sow division in China, right? We know for a fact that the USA is involved in trying to manipulate the labor movement in China. They have the free trade union associations that were set up by Jay Lovestone, that the AFL-CIO is involved in destabilizing China. We know there are a number of companies in China that are manipulated by the American government, that work against the Chinese government, and because they have business deals in America. And that, again, China has a very big market sector, right? The state controls the state-run industries, and the state has the ability to control companies, but there are probably capitalists in China, wealthy people that aren't loyal to the country. I mean, that shouldn't be a shocker, right? Shouldn't be a shocker to anybody that such a thing might happen, that there might be capitalists in China who are, wrapped up in business deals with Joe Biden and aren't loyal to the Communist Party. Why is that a shocker to anybody? Right. I'd be curious about the specifics of what is in the Hunter Biden laptop. I'd like to see the specifics of it, but I don't find the idea that there could be corrupt companies in China doing business with Hunter Biden. I don't find that surprising at all. And I don't think that really is a shocker. That doesn't mean China controls the United States. It means that Hunter Biden is corrupt and Joe Biden is corrupt, and that there may be entities in China that are corrupt with him. And that's not good. I'm against corruption. I'm against shady, backhanded business deals. But I don't think that means the Chinese Communist Party is responsible. And I don't think that means, therefore, that the Democrats work for the Chinese Communists. They clearly don't. Why did Nancy Pelosi go to Taiwan, for Christ's sakes? So, and that's a big point that the what do you call it? The Trump MAGA world, they really like to play up this idea that somehow China is involved in some kind of underhanded conspiracy in the United States. So there you go. Thoughts on the California shootings? I saw that, there's a mass shooting in the United States every time you turn around. And we're still waiting for details to come out. I know that they're not, last I heard, I wasn't following it very closely, but the last I heard, they were still looking for the motive, and I don't know. I really, really don't know. And, we really don't know. I mean, it's not uncommon for shooters to get into Nazism simply because Hitler killed a lot of people, and that white supremacist ideology is very ugly and mean-spirited. Right. I know the mass shooter, the big mass shooting in Columbine, one of the shooters actually had the words natural selection on his chest as he was committing his mass murder, because that was a reference to Friedrich Nietzsche. It was a reference to social Darwinism, and they specifically targeted one student because he was black, called him racial slurs, that happened. Furthermore, there were other examples of mass shooters. There was a shooter in, I think, Minnesota, who was actually of Native American heritage, but he called himself a Native American National Socialist, and he was a Nazi, right? Because, again, he's attracted to the murder part. He's attracted to the bigotry and the hate, right? So is it possible that this shooter came across white supremacist ideas or fascistic? Look, at the root of all of this, I'll say this, and this is a big thing I've been writing about and talking about and reading about. George Lukács wrote this book, The Destruction of Reason, about philosophical irrationalism. That's the ideology of serial killers. Philosophical irrationalism. There is no right and wrong. Might makes right. That, this is Ayn Rand, right? The virtue of selfishness. Compassion is a form of weakness. Admiration for murderers. Admiration for killers. That kind of thinking. That is very popular among our elite, and it's widely promoted in our society at this time. Friedrich Nietzsche is kind of the father of this kind of thinking, with his writing, Beyond Good and Evil, and his critique of what he calls slave morality and Übermenschen and the Blonde Beast and all of that. However, it's widely promoted all throughout our society. It's very, very widely promoted. And the thing about philosophical irrationalism, and this is, people are pointing out, oh, well, this is an Asian person or something. Well, the thing about philosophical irrationalism is it's not loyal to any group. In its essence, it's anti-human. It views human beings as evil. It views solidarity among people as very dangerous. It's anti-human. And like Virginia Tech, the shooting at Virginia Tech, right? That was an Asian American young man who engaged in that shooting, not white. But if you listened to some of the things he said, it was hatred for humanity. And that really drives a lot of these murderers. Is they hate the human race. They hate the human race, and they believe they a lot of them. The shooter in New Zealand who was a white supremacist or whatever, but he eco-fascism and the belief that we need to drive down the population and eugenics and all of this for the sake of the environment because of global warming. That was a big part of his manifesto, was eco-fascism, right? And they don't speak about that, right? And that the issue is not so much, people want to make it about the racism, but if someone's really a racist, I mean, the logical conclusion of actual racism is you get together with people of the same race as yourself and you start to advocate on behalf of your race at the expense of another race. That's the logical conclusion of racism. These mass shooters, they're not doing that. They're lone wolves, right? They're isolated on their own, and they're depressed and they're hopeless and they're hateful and they're antisocial. And in their minds, they're not trying to get together with people of the same race and advocate for their race. They are actually going out and trying to, and they tend to kill people of the same race as themselves. Often, no, not always, but they tend to target people who are of the same race as themselves. Their hate is for humanity. It's, and the racism may appeal to them, and especially what they call philosophical irrationalism, Nietzsche and Ayn Rand. Nietzsche, Ayn Rand, that kind of stuff is anti-human. And that stuff laid the basis for Nazism. Now, Nazism was a break with it because Nazism was an attempt to build some kind of populist movement. Nietzsche is inherently anti-populist, right? So the Nazis had to break with Nietzsche. Nietzsche was an influence on what they did, but they weren't Nietzschean because Nietzsche would never have built a mass popular movement. He hated people in general. But philosophical irrationalism is an expression of antisocial sentiments, people that are anti-human. Friedrich Nietzsche, Leo Strauss, Ayn Rand, this is just inherently anti-human ideology. And that is what these mass shootings are an expression of. They admire killers and murderers. They think right and wrong are for suckers. They don't have any compassion or kindness. They torture animals from the time that they're little. It's a certain way of being. You think about, there was a horrendous case that got a lot of publicity during the 1920s. There were two young men in Chicago from very wealthy families who they were young men and they were gay. Loeb and Leopold, they were called. And they were two young men who were gay. One of them was kind of easily influenced by the other one. I think one of them was a little bit disabled and had some problems. And the other one was actually a full-blown antisocial sociopath. And they murdered a mentally retarded boy to see it if they could. And they asked one of the killers in this case. It was widely promoted. These two wealthy young men who committed this horrendous crime. This mentally handicapped young man. They just grabbed him and brutally murdered him. Just to see if they could get away with it. They asked one of them, he said he did it because he wanted to know what it would feel like to be a murderer. He said, what would it feel like to be a murderer? And he said he was disappointed after he killed this mentally retarded young man because he didn't feel anything. That's a level of sickness that's and you read about the Loeb and Leopold case, very famous murder from the 1920s where there was, and Friedrich Nietzsche's philosophy was a central part of it. Friedrich Nietzsche's philosophy, they cited it, where they had read in school, they'd studied Nietzsche and they'd read that, there was no morality and that some people were just naturally superior to others. And, what's kind of famous is that Clarence Darrow was the attorney for Loeb and Leopold. And he managed to get them off of death row, prevent them from getting the death penalty for what they did. And he gave this long speech about right and wrong and how do we really know what right and wrong is. And these are young men and he gave this long speech that moved the judge and the jury. It was this really long, like 8-hour speech he gave at this trial that just went on and on and on. about what does morality really mean. And these young men, they'd studied Nietzsche, and and that it's an interesting case, but I don't know. I'm going on and on about these things, but you know, you know, there's a certain there's a certain section of people that they want to like simplify this problem. This problem of mass shootings that we're having in the United States is very historically unique. Very, very historically unique. This is not a problem they've had in other societies, right? It's pretty unique. It tends to be young men, it tends to be young white men, but not always, right? There's the guy in Las Vegas was a very old man. There's the guy at Virginia Tech was not white. These young men who are antisocial and mentally ill, and they go on killing sprees. And they commit mass murders that are intended to be suicides, right? They intend to die, but they want to be famous, or they want to go down in history as a killer. They want people to know who they were, and they do something really, really horrendous. And it's an expression of antisocial behavior, and it's particularly unique, and it's related to America and the social problems that we're having. And are these young men who do this often, they have studied white supremacist and fascist ideas. That's true. That absolutely is true, but that's not all there is to it. It's like they're interested in that stuff because they associate it with mass murder, because they associate it with bigotry. And that's why they are like that. But there you go. All right, next question. What are my favorite documentaries? Wow. What are my favorite documentaries? I will say that, the most famous documentarian in history is Michael Moore, obviously. And he was better at one time. He sucks now, right? But he was pretty good at one point. Bowling for Columbine, when that movie came out, that really made a difference. That was, after 9/11, Bush was president, the war on terror had gotten started, and he made this film called Bowling for Columbine that was an indictment of U.S. society and violence and alienation. It was really a powerful, well-made film. Then he made this movie called Fahrenheit 9/11, which wasn't a very good movie. It was just he threw everything at the kitchen sink at Bush. But then he made another movie about healthcare that was pretty good called Sicko. And that movie was pretty good. And like the end of it, when they go to Cuba, and it was more than just about healthcare. It was like a critique of capitalism, like a social democratic critique. And those, Michael Moore he is somebody, he came out of kind of a social democratic perspective. Unfortunately, now almost everything he says just offends me at this point. He's just a Democrat, and I can't even listen to him talk now. He's just gotten to be so bad. But at one point he was putting out better content. But in terms of documentaries, what kind of documentaries do I like? There's one documentary that I really enjoyed. It's called Berkeley in the 60s. And it's about the University of California, Berkeley, and the radical protest movements that went on there, from the free speech movement, where they were demanding the right of college students to protest on their campuses and be involved in political causes, to the Black Panthers. And that was really powerful. Go watch Berkeley in the 60s. And that shows you the history of, the civil rights movement, the anti-Vietnam War movement, the free speech movement at Berkeley. That's pretty good. I learned a lot from watching that documentary, Berkeley in the 60s. That's pretty good. It shows you like the rise of Ronald Reagan. Reagan was the governor who was like fighting with the college radicals at Berkeley. That was quite interesting. That's a good documentary. I'm trying to think what other documentaries that I've seen that are pretty good. People laugh when I tell them this. I'm almost embarrassed to tell you this, but I'll just be honest. A friend of mine years ago told me, Caleb, there's a new movie about Mike Tyson, and it's really good. And I didn't believe him. I'm like, are you serious? It's about that boxer, Mike Tyson, the convicted rapist who talks with a lisp and all of this. And they're like, yeah, it's actually pretty good. And so I watched it. And honestly, it was an amusing film. I didn't know very much. I'm not a sports guy, and he was kind of before my time. I was like a kid when Mike Tyson was big. And I watched this like documentary that was like, it was very artistically made about the life of Mike Tyson. And I watched it and I was just like, wow, I never would have thought to watch this. I'm not a sports guy. Mike Tyson's not somebody who appeals to me, but honestly, having watched it, I felt like I learned a lot by watching it. And that's what really makes a good film. A good documentary, you watch a documentary and you feel like you learned something. It held your attention, but it taught you something. And it took you places you wouldn't normally go. And it showed you parts of the world you wouldn't normally see. It presented you with perspectives you wouldn't normally know about. And I watched this documentary about Mike Tyson. It worked. I mean, I never would have thought in a million years that I would have enjoyed it, but I did. I enjoyed watching that Mike Tyson documentary. So documentaries, they're a good genre of film. I mean, I don't know. There's a lot of them. And nowadays with YouTube, there's a lot of like YouTube documentaries, right? Do those count? I don't know. But there you go. But yeah, I mean, there's a lot of good documentaries out there. The Revolution Will Not Be Televised. That's a documentary about Venezuela and Hugo Chavez and the coup attempt against Hugo Chavez. And it shows the manipulation of the media, how the media was used in trying to overthrow Hugo Chavez and the coup attempt. In 2002, there was a U.S. CIA coup in Venezuela against Hugo Chavez. Hugo Chavez was arrested and it failed. He eventually came back to power. And there's a very good documentary, The Revolution Will Not Be Televised, that kind of documents those events. That's pretty powerful. I would recommend going to see that. That was pretty good. If you can go watch The Revolution Will Not Be Televised. That was pretty good. Trying to remember what other documentaries have I enjoyed. What other documentary films have I enjoyed over the years? There's a lot of good ones. So yeah. There you go. All right. Next question. Will there be a petition for those who cannot attend on February 19th? Well, let's find out. Let's go to the website of Rage Against the War Machine. February 19th is Rage Against the War Machine, a very important anti-war protest happening in Washington, D.C. And this person is asking, is there a petition that you can sign? And I guess there is. I mean, there's a place on the website that says register. Join us and get updates and register. So yeah, here you go. If you want to become involved with Rage Against the War Machine, you can go here. And yes, the Center for Political Innovation, we are official sponsors. So there you go. All right. All righty. Very good. Very, very good. All right. David Rovix has a song, The Ballad of a Wobbly. Who is it about? Because there were many famous Wobblies. Is it about a specific member of the IWW? I haven't heard that Dave Rovix song. Dave Rovix has a good song on everything. His song about the St. Patrick's Battalion is very good. One of my favorite songs about the American soldiers who switched sides and joined with Mexico in the Mexican-American War. And he has a song about John Brown that I've listened to like a million times, and I really love it. He's pretty cool. David Rovix is pretty cool. Like his stuff. All right. 70s Maoism and its influence on patriotic socialism. That's an interesting question. First of all, what's patriotic socialism? I don't know what it is, right? It's just socialism has always been patriotic. The goal of socialism is to make a better country, like to enact policies, control the means of production to make the country better. Socialism is by definition patriotic. Right? It wants to make life better in the country in which socialism is adopted. So it is by definition patriotic. People who think you can't be, oh my God, patriotic socialism, that means you're a Nazi. It's like there's this cringe left contrarianism. I hate the American flag. I'm so revolutionary. It's like, no, socialism has always been patriotic. Always. We're against the wars because we don't want Americans to die for Wall Street. We say that people around the world have the right to control their countries, just like we have the right to control our country. I mean, it's like there's nothing that is in socialism that would make it unpatriotic. Now, we're against chauvinism, obviously. We don't go around saying that our country is better than all the other countries. Right? We're opposed to any form of national chauvinism. We're opposed to any form of I don't know what you want to call it, bigotry or colonialism or denying the right of self-determination to people. But go and read, if you really want to, patriotic socialism, go and read Lenin's very famous essay on great Russian patriotism. Lenin on great Russian patriotism, right? On the national pride of the great Russians. I was looking at this essay last night, and he very much says we are loyal to our homeland. Even though Russia is an empire, we support Russia. We are proud to be Russian. And we want, we approach workers. We are proud of Russia. We want Russia to be a stronger country. We want self-determination for oppressed nationalities. Lenin appealed to great Russian national pride, right? And even though Russia was called the prison house of nations, Lenin was patriotic to Russia. Even though he rejected the Tsar, he was patriotic to Russia. If Lenin can be patriotic to Russia, why be unpatriotic to the United States? I don't get it, right? Yes, we don't support the Constitution. We don't support colonialism. We don't support racism. We support the right of self-determination for oppressed people. But it's like, are we trying to make life in the country worse? No. Are we trying to make life in the country better? Yes. Will socialism make a better life for the Americans? Yes. Will breaking out of imperialism make a better country for America? Yes. Like, it's pretty basic stuff, right? But there's this like liberal moralism. I hate America. It's this childish, right? Childish. I don't know what you want to call it, but someone's asking, how is that influenced by the 1970s new communist movement? Well, unfortunately, the new communist movement of the 70s, they were, especially the Revolutionary Communist Party, they burned the American flag. Right. The Revolutionary Communist Party, they would chant red, white, and blue. We spit on you. You stand for plunder. You will go under. They had that heritage of the new left. They admired the Black Panthers. And, they would chant, we are not Americans. We are proletarians. The Communist Labor Party, they were patriotic. Nelson Peary and the Communist Labor Party, they advocated patriotism. And, if you read, Nelson Peary's work, he talks about that. Right. And they tried to revive kind of the Popular Front politics of the 1930s Communist Party. But most of the new communist movement, most of the NCM groups, the October League, the Communist Workers' Party, the RCP, because of their 1960s heritage and because of their anti-militarism or whatever, they did have this issue. And when they would critique the Communist Party USA, they often critiqued the patriotism. They came out of the new left, and the new left was a middle-class movement that was about opposing Cold War conformity. And so because of that, unfortunately, the 1970s new communist movement was tainted with a lot of this performative anti-patriotism. Now, I will say, and this is important to point out, right, is, the Revolutionary Communist Party, what they became after about 1979, 1980 is not a fair representation of what they were, right? The Revolutionary Communist Party, it was the Revolutionary Union of the Bay Area, and then they merged with the Black Workers Congress and this Puerto Rican organization, and they merged into the Revolutionary Communist Party in 1975. And they were a big organization in the 70s. They had maybe 10,000 members around the country. They had in 1976, they protested the bicentennial. They had about 5,000 people in Philadelphia to protest the bicentennial. Then they had a rally in California that was roughly the same size. So, they had influence. They could mobilize about 10,000 people to march for communism, which is pretty significant. And, they, at that point in the 70s, they still did aspire to be a mass organization. They formed something called the National Workers Union that was like a labor union. They had campaigns around food and housing. If you look at the rhetoric, their 1976 rally against the bicentennial, it was, we won't fight another rich man's war. We've carried the rich for 200 years. Now let's dump them off our backs. It was very much, it was an attempt to build a populist working class movement. Now, after Deng Xiaoping came to power in China, after the split in the Revolutionary Communist Party, when they expelled a lot of their members, when Bob Avakian became like the leader, when they started attacking China and opposing China very viciously, they became something completely different. And their flag burning fetish, you could call it, when they just started burning the flag everywhere, that was very much after they had kind of degenerated, I would argue. They degenerated. By about 1979, 1980, it became clear they kind of lost any mass aspiration. They became an ultra-leftist group. May Day 1980. In the lead up to May 1st, 1980, they engaged in a series of provocations around the country where they were basically just provoking American working class people to beat them up. They would go to the rallies. There were all these protests against Iran, these like patriotic rallies against Iran. And they would go there and provoke, the patriotic crowds to just beat them up. And, if you look at what they kind of deteriorated into, by about 1979, 1980, the RCP was a nut job group. I mean, and that's what they are now. I mean, with all due respect, I on some of these streams, I have, praised Bob Avakian for the strengths that he showed in the early 70s. And, I have recognized that they did important work against police brutality. And I even stood up for them when they were being canceled, right? Because Sansara Taylor is a pro-choice activist, and she was doing some effective pro-choice protests, and she was getting canceled. The mainstream media, they were all canceling her for that. And it was The Intercept, and everyone was saying, oh my God, the RCP is a cult. And, I defended them at that time. And, I give them credit. I was around them at one point when I was like 19, and they taught me to sell newspapers. They taught me to be go, go, go. And they taught me to engage with people on the street about communism. So I'll give them all credit for that. But I'll also tell you that, I'll just be honest with you. They're a nut group. They're fringe, and there is no way they will ever become a mass organization. They are fringe. They don't aspire. During the 1970s, when they were the new communist movement, they were one of the new communist movement groups. They tried to get out of the movement to the masses, and they were trying it really hard, and they took it to extreme lengths. Very extreme lengths, like, supporting the Boston busing riots, supporting the textbook riots in West Virginia. And if you read Bob Avakian's autobiography, he tells this story, which is hilarious, I think. And you can read it. It's actually like, if you type into Google, it'll come up. You'll find like the Google books of his book that, that the party, they decided that since white workers liked country music, because white workers liked country music, the RCP decided they were all going to like country music. And so Bob Avakian, he'd never liked country music before, but Jimmy Buffett, he liked Jimmy Buffett. And so Jimmy Buffett was going to be like his introduction to liking country music. And this is in his autobiography. He says he went to a Jimmy Buffett concert, and everyone at the concert was smoking weed. And they were all smoking weed. And in the Revolutionary Communist Party, they don't use drugs. So he wasn't supposed to use drugs. You know what I mean? But he was breathing in all this like secondhand marijuana. And he was looking out at the crowd of young people that were all smoking marijuana. And he was breathing in the weed. And he had this like great revelation that maybe the broad masses of white American workers weren't where the revolution would come from. And that they should stop tailing the backwardness of white workers. It's deep. It's deep. No, seriously, type Bob Avakian Jimmy Buffett concert. I'll read you his actual words. I think I can pull it up, right? Jimmy Buffett concert, Bob Avakian. It's like something else. It's really something else. Yeah, here we go. From Ike to Mao and beyond, my journey from mainstream America to revolutionary communism. Here we go. I will read you the passage. I'll just read you what he said. All right. But then, just to jump ahead a little bit, as the struggle with these Mensheviks was developing and sharpening up, particularly after the revisionist coup in China, I went to a Jimmy Buffett concert. I had listened to some Jimmy Buffett songs, because Jimmy Buffett sort of had one foot in youth culture and one foot in the country Western culture. He came to Chicago, and he had a band called the Coral Reefer Band. And of course, reefer was a play on words. On the one hand, you don't have to explain the joke, Bob. On the one hand, it referred to Caribbean influences in his music, but then on the other hand, it was reefer. Thank you for explaining the joke, Bob. At this Jimmy Buffett concert, there was lots of reefer, and there were a lot of jokes from the stage from Jimmy Buffett and his band about reefer, and a lot of people in the audience were smoking reefer. In this audience, there was some youth from the middle class, but there was also a lot of young white proletarians who were there who were into all of this. And this might seem odd, but even in the form of all this talk about reefer and the people joking about it, there was a certain rebellious edge. And it made me think, we've gotten into tailing after the intermediate sections of the working class and the even more backward white workers. There are workers, including among the white youth, who are alienated and rebellious, and more stable and more conservative tending workers that we've been focusing much of our work on. It is right to have a strategic orientation of winning as many people as possible to the more of the more intermediate workers and even more backward workers to socialism, but this should not be our main focus. In that way, this Jimmy Buffett concert, while in and of itself a small thing, was part of provoking questions in my mind politically and ideologically. At the same time, throughout this period, I had never stopped being drawn to the culture that I had developed a love for as a youth, namely Black culture and R&B music. Yeah. So Bob was at a Jimmy Buffett concert, and he realized that all these like white teenagers were smoking weed, and that was edgy. And then he realized you didn't need to win over the broad masses of white workers. You could win over alienated young people who smoked weed. I mean, that's, I don't even know what to say about that, and if you look at the RCP, that kind of makes sense, because after about 1979, 1980, they were not in the factories anymore. They were not in the factories anymore, and they were, they were, and that they were trying to recruit like people that were into punk music. They like took positions on the Clash and punk bands in the 80s. And they were, yeah. When Jimmy started playing, yeah, there you go. Yeah, Bob was at a Jimmy Buffett concert, and that's when he discovered that average Americans weren't revolutionary, but there were all these young teenagers who were smoking weed, and so that's who you should be trying to recruit, was like edgy teenage rebels who smoke weed, rather than the broad masses of Americans. It's yeah. Anyway, next question. Of all the things. Anyway, Saudi Arabia has big investments in Silicon Valley. What is their interest in it? The UK created the Saudi monarchy. What does data is the new oil mean? And is data financialized now? All right. Well, let's hit it one by one. Saudi Arabia has big investments in Silicon Valley. What is their interest in it? Well, the Saudis have a huge amount of money, right? Oil is a vital commodity. However, the value of what the Saudis has decreased at this point, right? Because of fracking, etc. The world is not as dependent on Saudi Arabia. The United States in particular doesn't need Saudi Arabia the way it once did. Didn't need it. So because of that, the Saudis are trying to be strategic, and they're trying to figure out how they can position themselves. Silicon Valley, at this point, it's pretty clear they have the ability to craft global public opinion. Facebook, it's very clear with their suppression of the Hunter Biden laptop story, and Twitter, I mean, they can decide elections. The search engines and the social media apps, they have the ability. Look, they've done a number on me, right? I mean, Google me, look at YouTube and all of that. Look what they've done to me, right? I mean, millions of people who've never met me think I'm an evil person, right? I mean, that's the power of Silicon Valley. So if you're Saudi Arabia, you're a country that cuts people's heads off, and you have a lot of money, you're going to want to be as invested in Silicon Valley as you possibly can, because if Silicon Valley really wanted to, they could destroy Saudi Arabia, right? If they just started exposing their crimes in Yemen and other places, they could destroy them. And they have a lot of money, and they're not as valuable to the Western capitalist powers as they used to be. So Saudi Arabia, in their interest, they really want to be tied in with where a lot of the power is in the world today, and that's in social media. Now, the UK created the Saudi monarchy. That's true. The Sykes-Picot Agreement drew up the borders of the modern Middle East. During World War I, you'll remember there were two sides. Then Russia and the United States and France and Britain were on one side, and Germany and Austria and Turkey were on the other side. And during the war, the British and the Russians and the Americans and the French got together and they drew up a map of what the Middle East would look like after they took over. They were going to break apart the Ottoman Empire. Turkey's empire would be abolished, and they would divide up the Middle East among themselves. The treaty that they drew up was called the Sykes-Picot Agreement. And the Sykes-Picot Agreement, it created Syria, it created Jordan, and it created Saudi Arabia. And it drew the borders of Saudi Arabia. And it gave it to the Saudi royal family, the House of Saud, because the House of Saud had been very loyal and effective fighters, proxy fighters for the British against the Ottomans. You ever see Lawrence of Arabia? Right? You ever see Lawrence of Arabia, the old movie about Thomas Edward Lawrence? Right? It was this famous British guy who organized the Arabs to fight the Turks. Right? Well, Lawrence of Arabia, Thomas Edward Lawrence, he was involved with the Saudis, with the Saudi royal family, the House of Saud, and that the British, the House of Saud, with their Wahhabi ideology, their belief in a very, very strict fundamentalist interpretation of Islam, was very effective in kind of building a solid block of forces to fight against the Turks. And the British found them to be very, very useful. Now there are some older documents that have been circulated claiming like the British started supporting the House of Saud in like the 1700s. And there's been people who've disputed the authenticity of that. But the British and the House of Saud, they have a long-standing relationship. And the Sykes-Picot Agreement is where the borders of Saudi Arabia were drawn up and where they, officially basically installed them to run the Arabian Peninsula. And the next part of the question is, what does data is the new oil mean? And is data financialized now? Well, data is the new oil. I think it refers to the fact that, that the dominant forces in the global economy historically have been those who run the oil bankers. But now it appears that control of information is tantamount to controlling oil, right? That just like, oil is everything. Oil is plastic. Oil is airplanes. Oil is cars. Oil is electricity in a lot of cases. Oil is essential. And if you control the oil business, like the Rockefellers and the big oil companies around the world, then you have a lot of power. But then that raises the question, right? Silicon Valley, which is largely an outgrowth of American intelligence and that oil banker apparatus that's in with the CIA, that Eastern establishment, in a way, they're more powerful than oil because they can set global public opinion. So just like the oil bankers kind of ran the global economy, now it seems like Silicon Valley very much is a wing of power. And is data financialized? Well, it's on the stock market. I mean, there's a lot of money to be made. If you can get the algorithms to speak in your favor, you can win a lot of people over. If you have them speaking against you, you can lose a lot. And people invest in it. And, the Saudis, it looks like they're being strategic and buying into it. So that all seems to make sense to me. I mean, everything's financialized nowadays, right? Everything's tied into the stock market in the West. Anything in the West, there's very little that isn't tied into the stock market. So, all right. Are oil bankers behind the green movement? That's a little bit of a trick question, right? Like, I'm supposed to say yes, and you're supposed to go, oh my God, the only reason anyone would care about the environment is because they got, propaganda from big oil. Well, obviously, Nature Conservancy has been around for a long time. There's been a lot of people who want to make sure there's forests to go hiking and to go fishing. There's a lot of people who didn't like when the Cuyahoga River in Cleveland caught on fire because it was so badly polluted, right? I mean, there's, the Clean Air Act and, the concern about pollution and how it impacts people breathing in the air, these are all legit things, right? I mean, and the idea that all of that is because of big oil. No, if it wasn't for big oil, there would still be people that were concerned about smog. There'd still be people that were concerned about making sure there was a forest to go hiking in. There'd still be people that were concerned about not making sure there wasn't overfishing and, keeping the ecosystem of the ocean balanced. Environmentalism in and of itself is a natural movement that you're going to have. You're going to have people that are going to say, hey, let's interact with the environment in a sustainable long-term way, which in capitalism, every individual capitalist wants to make as much profits as they possibly can. So that's kind of hard, right? So you can see that some people are going to step up and say, no, don't fish the ocean until there's no fish left. Don't, make the air so we can't breathe it. Don't dump so much pollution into the river that it catches on fire. None of that is because of big oil. All right. Obviously, you would have some kind of environmental movement to some degree or other, whatever. Now, big oil has corrupted the environmental movement, and that's different. For example, nuclear power, right? And there's a lot to document this. It used to be environmentalists were the biggest supporters of nuclear power. Believe it or not, environmentalists were the ones who thought that burning oil and burning coal was bad for the environment, and they thought nuclear power was good. But it was big oil that started paying environmentalists to be against nuclear power. And big oil was against nuclear power because it would put them out of business. And that a lot of environmentalists turned against nuclear power because there was a well-funded movement against nuclear power that came from big oil. The other thing is that big oil, and this is where it gets interesting, big oil benefits from less oil being on the market. The less oil there is out there, the higher the cost of oil is. The more oil that's out there, the lower the cost is. And big oil has rivalries with what they call little oil, which is at this point in the United States, it's been pretty thoroughly defeated. But throughout, up until like the pandemic, there was what they called the fracking cowboys. And they were these lower level capitalists who fracked oil out of the ground. And you had, Alaska, deep sea drilling and deep sea drilling and drilling in Alaska. And there are these lower level oil companies, like the Koch brothers, right? The Koch brothers and Noble Energy and people like that. Big oil can't stand those people. It wants to put them out of business. And they're their competitors. And big oil has all the money. And if there's going to be regulations, they're going to get to write them because they're big oil. And little oil is not going to get to write them. And that the debate around environmental laws, a lot of big environmental organizations, the Sierra Club, the National Wildlife Fund, they get big grants and donations that come from big oil because big oil would rather have environmental laws that they write than no environmental laws. Whereas lower level oil companies, they don't want any environmental laws because they know if there are environmental laws, they're going to be written by the big oil companies. So, yes, at this point, environmentalism is very well funded. BlackRock, the British investment firm, is one of the main, financiers of it. And they are promoting environmentalism like crazy. And at this point, environmentalism as a movement is largely a Malthusian degrowth movement. It is not really about saving the earth from the environment. It is about trying to save capitalism with degrowth. And that's what it's about. It's about imposing restrictions, trying to drive down the population, etc. That said, right, does that mean that there wouldn't be anybody who would go and say, save the forest? Obviously there are legit concerns. We don't want to breathe in, the Clean Air Act made life better. People breathed in more clean air and, the environmental movement in a lot of ways has done good things. So the environmental movement in and of itself is not inherently evil, but at this point, what has been called green fascism is the primary trend. Greta Thunberg, it's Malthusianism, it's anti-growth, it's anti-human. It is opposed to it is opposed, it's the Club of Rome, limits to growth. And it's dangerous and it's evil, right? So big oil can hijack all kinds of political movements. So I think that is the way I would like to answer that. And I don't know what your intention was with asking the question. Maybe it was just a fair question. But again, you have to be, there's nuance to a lot of these things. And what generally happens when people lie about me is they take something I say, and I'm talking about a one specific aspect of a very complex issue. And they take one specific thing and they say, he's saying all there is to it is this. And it's like, that's not what I said. Right? Like they took a clip of me from a stream talking about Samantha Power and her psychology and how it's similar. I was making the point that it's similar to Kamala Harris. It's similar to Amy Klobuchar. And they clip it and they say, oh, Caleb says the only reason Samantha Power wanted to overthrow Gaddafi was because of her abusive dad. And it's like, that's not what I said. Okay. I touched on the fact that there is, this certain mindset that's cultivated by the people that are pushing U.S. foreign policy, and they're similar. And it's like, I'm making a very complicated point. All right. And it's like, it's one point that fits into a much wider, nuanced, complicated issue. I'm trying to explain, woke psychology and where it comes from and how it's useful to the elites. And they take one aspect of it and they put it out there. And they're, oh my God, he's retarded. He said, and it's like, that's not what I said. Right. And it's just like, these people that's how they are. They never will respond to any point that I actually make. They always, and it's like, so that question, right? I have no idea who the person who asked that question is. You could have been the nicest person with good intentions, but it's like, what is generally happens, right? Is you ask me, is big oil behind environmentalism? It's more complicated than that. At this point, big oil has a lot of influence over environmentalism, and the ultra rich and their degrowth ideology has kind of hijacked environmentalism. But it's like, just me saying that, right? They're going to clip that and they're going to say, oh, Caleb said that no one would ever want to save a forest. No one would ever want to stop air pollution unless it was a big conspiracy from big oil. Oh my God, that's retarded. And it's like, this is how these people argue. And it's like, no, there is complexity and nuance to so much of this. There is a lot of complexity and nuance to these issues. We need to operate in our relationship with the environment in a way that's sustainable. We do. I mean, if we go out, and there was no restraint on fishing, pretty soon there'd be a shortage of fish. Right? You have to regulate how much fishing can go on so that the fish keep reproducing and you can keep fishing. And if you don't do that, if you just say, go fish, pretty soon they're going to go fish. They're going to get every fish, and then there won't be any fish left, and then we'll have no fish. Like, you have to interact with the environment in a sustainable way. So you obviously need to regulate things like fishing, things like mountaintop removal and mining and strip mining and things like that. I mean, there are obvious needs to regulate resource extraction and to be strategic about it, obviously. And no one, sure, there are some people, the Ayn Rand crowd that think capitalism is just amazing. And, maybe they disagree with that. But for the most part, most people understand that, there's a reason, you have to get a hunting license, and you can only shoot so many deer. In states where deer hunting is a popular pastime, they don't just say, all right, go get them, everybody. There's a hunting season. There's a hunting license. There's a reason for that, because if not, all the deer would be extinct. There's a reason that you hunt them in a certain season, that do you know what I'm saying? Like, it's like, so the idea that all regulation of the environment is a conspiracy, I never said that. But at this point, in the name of climate alarmism, it's not even environmentalism. I would call it climate alarmism. Climate alarmism is pushed by big oil, and it's pushing degrowth as the solution to the economic problems. That's the reality. So, there you go. I mean, and yeah, that's my point. And that the way these people talk about things is, again, the bread tuber crowd. It's like, they'll take something that I say that by itself, if you just showed it to people, they'd say that's fine. And they say, well, yeah, but what that means is, and then they'll pull up something completely unrelated that, like, a Nazi said. I could say, I love my country. And, If you just said, oh, Caleb said he loves his country, and that's when most people love their country. So what they'll do is the bread tubes will show me saying, I love my country. And then they'll have a quote from Hitler in 1934 saying, I love Germany. And they're like, see? And like, I don't know how dumb their audience must be to buy this kind of shit, but it's like, that's the way that they interact with me. That's the way that they speak about me. So, you know, when people are that dishonest, you know, obviously degrowth and the belief in degrowth and climate alarmism and what was done to Sri Lanka and that stuff is not good. And the belief that human beings are a cancer, the belief that we need to drive down the population, the Green New Deal, reducing consumption, I'm opposed to all of that. The problem isn't humanity. The problem is capitalism. Now, the last super chat I have here is someone recommending that I listen to a song by someone named Willie Dunn, and it's called I Pity the Nation. Not familiar with the song, but I'll have to check it out. So there you go. All right, folks. Well, listen, it's been fun. It's been a fun stream tonight. I will be back at some point. You know, I'm going on a little trip here in the next few days, so I might not be back until next week, but I might get a stream in sooner than that. We shall see. We'll just have to see how things go. I might get a stream in before next week, but if not, I'll be back. Check me out on Combo Couch tomorrow. You know, we're just going to keep doing our thing. I'll be out of town for a few days, getting everything in order. And yeah, mark your calendar, February 19th. Mark your calendar for March 25th and 26th. And I'll put on the closing music. It's been fun, everybody. It's been fun. It's been fun. It's been a lot of fun. Surge in the struggle against U.S. imperialism is now emerging throughout the world. Ever since World War II, U.S. imperialism and its followers have been continuously launching wars of aggression. But the people of various countries have been continuously waging revolutionary wars to defeat their aggression. And while the danger of a new world war still exists, and the people of all countries must get prepared, revolution is the main trend in the world today.